Good morning again. My name is Frank Moore. I'm the director of the Latin American and Caribbean Center here at FIU, and I want to be the first to welcome all of you to this event. It is, I think, an example of the kind of work that we are trying to do here at LACC and at FIU. And we're just delighted that we were able to partner with Universidad Católica de Uruguay and with the Open Society Foundation to bring and release this important piece of research that is not only rigorous in its topic, that is marijuana legalization in Uruguay and its implications in other parts, but it has a policy relevant impact. This is the kind of work, systematic, rigorous work that folks in policymaking at the OAS and other organizations find, I think, and I hope and expect that find interesting and useful in the work they do day in and day out. And I want to first thank my colleague, Jose Miguel Cruz, the Director of Research at LACC, for spearheading this important work with colleagues from the Universidad Católica de Uruguay, which you'll hear about in a second. This, as I believe Jose Miguel will say, is research that is conducted by the newly established Latin American Marijuana Research Initiative, LAMRI is how we're calling it, which is formed here by the Latin American Caribbean Center at FIU and the Universidad Católica de Uruguay, with funds, as I mentioned, from Open Society. I want to thank our colleagues from la Universidad Católica and our discussants today that will be introduced in a second for joining us in presenting, as I said, this very important research to the public. This will be an ongoing research, that is to say, it does not end here. We will continue moving forward on examining perhaps other countries. So we hope that this is the start of a large and significant research project on this topic of legalization and regulation. So with that, once again, I want to thank you for being here. Before I turn the mic over to Jose Miguel, I want to make sure, as I've been told, that lunch will be served at the end of the event. So stick around, and if you have friends and colleagues who might be interested both in the work and in lunch, text them, send them an email, and come tell them to join us. Jose Miguel?
Thank you, Frank, for that nice introduction, and thank you all for coming today so early and basically facing the challenge of having to deal with parking and security here at the campus with the visit of our president. So as Frank said, this is the first of, we hope, many public presentations on the result of this research on marijuana in Uruguay. We called it, and as a result of this initiative, we have called it the Latin America Marijuana Research Initiative. And this is a joint effort of the Latin American Caribbean Center, the Universidad Católica de Uruguay, Insights Research and Consulting, and Open Society Foundation. So this project started from a sort of more modest research initiative called the Transformation of Drug Policy, the Impact of Marijuana Legalization in Uruguay. And as we started to work on this, we realized the potential to really get deeper into all the things that involve the policy of changing or the decisions of making policy change in Uruguay. So that's how we have expanded this research And now our project focuses in 4 areas, actually. There is a component, a very important component about the analysis of the enactment of and regulation process in Uruguay. So when we hear about marijuana legalization in Uruguay, we assume, for instance, that this is similar to what is happening here in the United States, in Colorado, in Washington, and now in Alaska. It's not. It's a very different process, and we believe it is important to understand what is happening in Uruguay in its own perspective. The second component is this public opinion analysis in Uruguay, and not only in Uruguay, but also in the United States and El Salvador. We have this advantage that 3 members of our team are also members of the network of the Americas Barometer, the Latin American Public Opinion Project at Vanderbilt University. And we were able to convince our colleagues in Vanderbilt to include some of the questions on marijuana, not only in Uruguay, but also in El Salvador, which is the country I supervise, and also the United States. And we have the opportunity then to see Uruguay under this comparative perspective with El Salvador and the US. The third component, that is sort of the core of the initial initiative on research, is about the impact on behavior among frequent consumers. And this revolves around a respondent-driven sample survey, an RDS survey that we conducted in Montevideo, in the metropolitan area of Montevideo, in November and December. This is a survey that we did basically with heavy consumers of marijuana in Uruguay. And finally, and this is a part in the making, there's a component of the profile and membership of cannabis clubs. We want to understand how these cannabis clubs work in Uruguay. What we're going to present here, first, we divide the whole event today in 2 parts. First, you're going to hear the results of the research so far. As I said, this is a preliminary research. And the researchers, we're going to present this. First, we'll hear from Emily Bello Pardo, who is our LACC drug policy, our student fellow actually in our LACC drug policy research program. So she's a student in our Latin American Caribbean Masters program, and she's been part of the team. So she will present a portion of the research that she's been focusing on. Then I will present another part. And I'll be followed by Rosario Queirolo. And Rosario Queirolo is associate professor at the Department of Social and Political Studies at the Universidad Católica of Uruguay. And she will present part of the results on prevalence of marijuana in Uruguay. And then we'll hear from Maria Fernanda Boidi, who is the Director of Insights Research and Consulting, and who is also part of the network of researchers at LAPOP, Vanderbilt University, and she will present the results on RDS. Then, after that, we'll hear comments from our guests today, Hannah Hetzer, who is the policy manager of the Americas at the Drug Policy Alliance, based in New York. She serves as DPA's liaison for Latin America and broader international issues, closely following, supporting, and informing development in drug policy reform in the region. So she will provide comments on the results. And then we'll hear from Bo Kilmer, who is a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation, where he co-directs the RAND Drug Policy Research Center. So we'll hear from them, and then we'll open the floor to questions and comments on the research. Let me close this part, not before thanking you all, and especially thanking Frank Mora for the support for this research and the Latin American Caribbean Center, but also our participants today who made the not short trip coming from Uruguay, actually, to attend this and have this tour also in Washington, presenting some of these results, and also our discussants today to both Kilmer and Hannah Hetzer. We are all very grateful for their presence here. So let me pass then the floor to Emily.
Thank you, Dr. Cruz, for that presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Also, I would like to thank the Latin American Caribbean Center for having given me the opportunity as a master's student to be part of this project and to be able to do some of the research I've been doing for the past year. Now, today, I will focus on the process of the enactment of this marijuana legalization, how it happened, the legal framework, so that I can give like a context for everything that my colleagues and supervisors will present to you today. All right, so the first question that I started to tackle when I started to do my research is, how did marijuana regulation occur in Uruguay? So the first thing that we have to keep in mind, as Dr. Cruz mentioned before, is that the reasons for the regulation of marijuana in Uruguay are completely different from the reasons that marijuana is being legalized in the United States, in certain states. Now, the background for this that we have to keep in mind, number one is, in Uruguay, marijuana had been decriminalized since 1974, which means that there had been all of this period of time where marijuana usage has been socially accepted. That context is particularly and significantly different from the experience of the United States, where marijuana is illegal. So in 1974, there was a law, that's Law 14294, that decriminalized marijuana, but it introduced one major loophole in the marijuana legalization process, in the marijuana regulation, which in Article 31, they said that marijuana will be allowed to be used by a minimal quantity. But this minimal quantity of marijuana was to be determined by a judge. What this created was a system where marijuana was decriminalized, but it was able, but it would need people to go to prison, depending on the reasoning of a judge. And this is a very discretionary process, and it opened the, it created the opening for the marijuana legalization that we see today. So this marijuana legalization occurred in 2013, in December 2013, after over a year of it being in Congress, because it was introduced in August of 2012. It was President Jose Mujica's initiative because he's the one who spearheaded this legalization process, and it was also furthered by civil society, certain groups of civil society that took a very deep interest in having this legalization occurring. There were certain reasonings as to why the government tried to put forth this legalization. Number one, and the most important one, is that it was presented as a measure to decrease drug trafficking, to impact el narcotráfico, to decrease the perception of insecurity among the people, because it was people thought that because narcotráfico and all of these things are occurring in Uruguay, then this led to an increase in citizen insecurity. So that was one of the first rationales that the government started to utilize in order to legalize marijuana. The second one was like an emphasis on health, right? We have this product that people are acquiring in the black market, that people have to resort to certain areas called bocas that were not very secure. And they acquire a product that was maybe not necessarily as pure or as decent as they could acquire otherwise. So this was another reason why the government's like, okay, people already use it, people will use it. So how about we try to change the emphasis from prohibition into reducing the harms that they will be exposed to. So those are like mainly the goals and how this started to occur. Now, after the law was passed, this created a system that's fundamentally different from the systems we see here in the United States, where the Uruguayan state is taking a big role into allowing people to acquire marijuana. So there's a different role for the state in Uruguay because they will allow people to acquire marijuana in 3 different ways. The first one that people are going to be allowed to acquire it is by growing it in their own homes. So in this first way that people can acquire it, they will be allowed to have up to 6 marijuana plants per household with an annual crop of 480 grams, which is, some people say that it's plenty because they can acquire 40 grams per month. Now, there's been questions about how can the state regulate that a home plant can have 40 grams per month. There's been some questions about how the state can actually enforce this, but the fact of the matter is people are registering, as we will see later on. However, some people are kind of adamant and are like, wait a minute, so now the state is going to, how are they going to regulate something that's happening within my own home? So that's something to keep in mind. That's the first way that people can acquire marijuana. The second one is through registering in a cannabis club, where basically 15 to 45 members have to register a civil association. It has to be registered not only as a civil association, but also with the Instituto de Regulación de Cannabis, which is a new institution that the Uruguay government is creating. So something to keep in mind when we're thinking about all of this is that Uruguay is creating a completely new institutional framework to regulate marijuana. And it doesn't happen overnight. It happens as a process. So some of these initiatives, like particularly the third one, which is selling through pharmacies, right? We have to keep in mind that to be able to do this, the Uruguay state has to have new institutions. It has to have new regulations, and that doesn't happen overnight. So in the sell through pharmacies, basically the Uruguayan states will grow marijuana through 5 private sellers who will be allowed to grow marijuana within premises of the government. What this means is that the government will take a very active role in allowing the marijuana to be grown in their premises, to then distribute the marijuana through pharmacies, and then sell the marijuana. This is extremely different from anything we have seen anywhere in the world, not only here in the United States, but it's very different from the models that people can think of in Portugal, where marijuana and every drug is decriminalized, but also very different from the Netherlands. It's very different from what you can encounter when you go to Amsterdam. So when the state takes this big role, it would regulate the prices of marijuana, and it would take a very active role in creating this system. So when we see these 3 ways of obtaining marijuana, there are certain commonalities that I will want to discuss before I turn over the floor. The first one is that now people will have to register in a civil registry saying, look, I want to access marijuana. And something to keep in mind also is if you register as a home grower, you cannot access marijuana through pharmacies. It's mutually exclusive. So the Uruguayan state created this entire new institutional framework, and it's completely new, as I said before. That's an entire process that has to go on, even though the Uruguayan state has said in the past, okay, we will start the sale in pharmacies on this date, let's say in July of last year. They have kept pushing it back, and this last initiative has not started to happen. A couple of weeks ago, Julio Calzada from La Junta Nacional de Drogas actually said that it would start in mid-year. However, the marijuana producers have not even been selected. So when the Uruguayan state selects them, then you have to actually have the crop, and it's a process that you have to wait for it. It's not like, okay, let me put the seed of marijuana, and then in 2 days, kaboom, we have a plant. No, it doesn't happen that way. We have to wait for it, and it's going to take time. Personally, I don't know if this timeline is going to be kept pushing back, so we will have to wait and see how that happens. And the main debate in this year is going to be that whether the state can make it mandatory or compulsory for these growers or for the pharmacies to sell the marijuana that the government is going to grow. And also the second part is in March 1st, there's going to be a change in administration. It's going to be a change in administration towards a president of the same party that President Mujica was. However, when we see later on in the results that one of the main reasons why people would support marijuana is because of Pepe Mujica, this is something to really keep in mind. This is going to be a change in government towards a 76-year-old politician, Tabaré Vázquez, who has been president in the past, but who has already said, if the sale to pharmacies, we don't see the results, we will see if we have to change it. So it's very malleable. The situation is very malleable. It's going to keep on going, and we have to wait and see how all of this is going to keep occurring. So with that said, thank you very much again. Now I'm going to turn over the floor to my colleagues and Dr. Cruz.
Thank you, Emily. Excellent presentation. So let me present the part about attitudes toward marijuana in Uruguay, and you will see this why the differences with the United States. You may have heard that certainly in Uruguay, the Congress passed the bill with little support from the Uruguayan public, actually. And this has to do with the fact that, as Emily said, it was a top-down process. Basically, the president came up with this initiative as part of a strategy for security called Convivencia Ciudadana. So they put marijuana legalization as part of this initiative, and it was an initiative coming basically from the presidency. However, there was some activist mobilization. There were some parts of the Uruguayan society, and as we will see, not a large part, but still an important part, that was pro marijuana legalization. And this mobilization basically presented the legalization of marijuana as part of a civil rights movement, right? Part of a broader movement to increase civil rights that included marijuana, abortion, and equal marriage. Actually, but when we compare the attitudes of Uruguayans toward these three things, they're very different attitudes. For instance, in the case of equal marriage, most Uruguayans are pro-equal marriage. In case of abortion, Uruguayans are divided, polarized regarding abortion. And in the case of marijuana, actually, basically, most of the people were against the legalization of marijuana. And this is basically a third of Uruguayans, as 2014 actually approved the new marijuana regulations. I mean, if you see the results over there of people who said in our America's Barometer survey that strongly agreed with the marijuana legalization, you will have that only 34% of people agreed with marijuana regulation. You can see the difference here with the United States. In the United States, when we asked whether they will approve legalization of marijuana in the U.S., more than half of Americans, this is a national-wide poll, more than half of Americans approve regulation of marijuana in the U.S. In Uruguay, it's only a third, and in El Salvador, which hasn't even started any conversation about marijuana legalization, is less than 10%. So you see the huge differences here, but you see that Uruguay, the first country in regulating the whole line of marijuana commercialization, consumption, and production, basically only a third of the population approved. And in fact, only, most Uruguayans, had negative opinions about marijuana consumption. We included a series of questions about, all those things that people consider that marijuana can produce or can be harmful. And we asked them to tell us whether they agree or disagree with these arguments. So, for instance, we put together these are not percentages, just to clarify, these are averages because we basically factor all the responses in an average that goes from 0 to 100. 100 meaning that everybody agreed with that statement. So you can see there that above 70 in a 0 to 100 scale basically score that marijuana is harmful to people's health. So most Uruguayans believe that marijuana is harmful to people's health. Then most of Uruguayans also believe that marijuana is the gateway to hard drugs. That's one of the usual arguments that we hear in many discussions. Also, most Uruguayans believe that people will continue buying illegal marijuana, and they are not so wrong in this. Actually, as Maria Fernanda will show later on, we find some evidence of this sort of thinking. And then the only statement that actually was low among Uruguayans was this idea that marijuana consumers are a threat to society. Other than that, the others basically were widespread among the Uruguayan public. Also, most Uruguayans believe that with the law, consumption and illicit trafficking will increase. And you have, again, that very, very, very high levels of people saying that homegrown marijuana will increase, that marijuana consumption in general will increase, that drug trafficking will increase, that drug consumption will grow, and that illicit sales will grow. So people had actually negative opinions about that. So why did government enacted the marijuana law? We asked this to Uruguayans, and actually around 18% of our survey said that they didn't know, that they didn't have any idea why the government went ahead with this. Among those who responded to the question, well, most of them, or almost half of them, said that, well, the government did this as a way to tackle crime and drug trafficking for public security reasons. And then other people told us to regulate a phenomenon that was already occurring, to make money, to get richer, to get the people at the government make more money. And few people mention public health, get political support votes, and other different reasons. Now, we also asked whether they believe that after the regulation, whether things will improve or worsen in Uruguay. And we asked them around different things, whether the country's fight against drug trafficking will improve or not. So a little bit about half of the people said, yeah, will improve, but they weren't that convinced either, right? Another important opinion was that people will have more individual freedoms, that the access to marijuana basically is part of this idea of having more freedoms. Then rather a minority of people said that with marijuana the country's healthcare system will improve. Actually, not everybody believed that, or even some people didn't believe that the country in general will improve, or the security situation in general. So what are the variables that are associated with regulation approval? So who are the people who actually see or view positively the legalization of marijuana in Uruguay? You have different variables there, and to explain very quickly this graph, the farther you see the dots, the different dots in the graph, the farther you see them from the green axis, the more related they are, or the more important they are to explain their opinions about regulation approval. Then you see the confidence interval, that is basically that line that goes around the dot, and it shows the confidence approval of that coefficient. And if the confidence interval doesn't touch the axis, that is statistically significant. So in other words, what this graph is saying, let me put it here, that people who approve the president's job, people who see positively the president's job, is the same people who, or are the same people who approve the marijuana law. So their views on the president played an important role for supporting the regulation of marijuana. You can see the predicted values over there of marijuana regulation approval related to president's job approval. You can see almost a perfect relationship over there, a positive relationship over there. The more people approve the president, the more they wanted to, they approve regulation of marijuana. Also, previous experiences with marijuana. And people who had experience with marijuana, well, obviously they also approve the regulation of marijuana in a very significant way. But here is another interesting finding, and this is that the number of relatives or friends who use marijuana, and this is an independent effect, meaning that people who approve the regulation of marijuana are not only the people who themselves consume marijuana, but also who have relatives or friends or know people who consume marijuana, even if they don't consume marijuana. So having a close sort of group or network in which people consume marijuana, even though they don't consume marijuana, well, they are positive, they are open to the regulation. Another important variable is ideology. I'm going to present the results later on, but let me just make a stop here and compare with the United States. What are the variables associated with regulation approval in the US? And we see some similarities, actually. For instance, previous experiences with marijuana. So people who have tried marijuana in the US obviously are pro regulation or legalization of marijuana in the US. Also, the president's job approval, and this is interesting, meaning that people who see Obama positively also tend to approve regulation of marijuana. Ideology plays an important role. Being a liberal in the case of the US, liberals tend to approve more regulation of marijuana than conservatives. But here's another interesting result, and this is the support for the system, and actually a negative relation with support of the system, meaning that the people who don't support the political system in the US tend to view more positively the approval of regulation of marijuana. This is completely the opposite that was happening in Uruguay. In Uruguay, approval or sort of support for the political system in Uruguay is positively related to regulation of marijuana, meaning that people who support the political system in Uruguay tend to also support approval for marijuana. Here is the opposite. And finally, in the US, age plays an important role. And this is a sort of generational point. Younger people in the US approve way more significantly the regulation of marijuana than older people. And then let me go back to ideology. You can see how ideology plays an important role both in Uruguay and the United States. But it's crucial, especially crucial in Uruguay. In Uruguay and the United States, basically the left has embraced marijuana. But in Uruguay, there is a huge difference between being in the left or being in the right. People in the right basically reject completely marijuana, almost completely. Whereas if you're in the left, basically you approve completely marijuana. In the United States, certainly you find the same relationship. But in the United States, conservatives tend to approve more marijuana than conservative Uruguayans. And this is an interesting comparison, especially because it also tells you about the difference here. In the United States, regulation of marijuana is driven by votes. It's driven by people going to the polls and asking for regulation of marijuana. In Uruguay, no. In Uruguay, it's a top-down process. In sum, about public opinion, the president's popularity played an important role in the regulation of marijuana in Uruguay. We cannot explain that without the charisma and the presence of the Uruguayan president. And although people have mixed feelings toward marijuana regulation, the law did not find significant popular opposition, even though people didn't like it, but they didn't actively oppose because it was not salient to the general public. And this is part of that very special or that very particular Uruguayan political culture, right? That, well, they believe they didn't agree, but it was not as important as other issues for them. So they let it pass. Even though, as it was framed by the government as an alternative to tackle increasing problems of security. I finished with this my part, and pass the mic to Rosario, who will present data about prevalence.
Well, thanks to everyone for being here, and again, thanks for Florida International University for this invitation. I'm going to talk you about who consumes and who doesn't consume marijuana in Uruguay. As you may know, there are several ways in which we can measure prevalence. I'm going to show you just 3 of them. One is life prevalence, which ask or measure, in a way, which percentage of the population has at least experienced or tried marijuana in their lives. Then we have annual prevalence, which is the percentage of the population that have consumed marijuana during the last 12 months, and monthly prevalence, which is the percentage of the people who have consumed marijuana during the last month. So, marijuana consumption has been increasing in Uruguay since we have reliable measures of prevalence. Life prevalence has quadrupled from 2001 to 2014. Annual prevalence increased by 6 times from 2001 to 2011, and monthly prevalence increased by 10 during the same period. Okay. This data that is presented in the figure is from the Encuesta Nacional sobre Consumo de Drogas en Hogares, which is a household survey, a national household survey carried out by the Junta Nacional de Drogas in Uruguay. And the 2014 data from this survey is not ready now, so they are kind of finishing the last analysis in order to make it public. So the 2014 data that is shown there is from the Americas Barometers survey, which is the survey that Miguel was talking you just before. So that was like the prevalence of the whole population, well, not the whole population, but 18 and older. So what about youth? Marijuana prevalence in youth has also doubled in 10 years. Yeah? The results of a different survey, which is the National Survey of High School Students, so students from 13 to 17 years old, indicate that year prevalence has doubled. 8.4 in 2003 and 17 in 2014. This survey captures not only students from public schools, it's also capturing students from private schools, but it's not representative of the whole youth because many young people don't go to school. So this is kind of the picture is representative of the students of those between 13 and 17 that attend to school. Okay, the starting age, and we have the 2011 data. At that time was 18.3. We have to wait to the survey that they are like finishing right now to see if in 2014 it is lower or is the same or higher. So the same information that I have tell you, so you can see how the prevalence, the year prevalence doubled among youth, the students. So in 2011, the year prevalence was 8.3% of the population, of the adult population, those over 18. Of those, the daily consumers were 14.6%. That is approximately 18,700 Uruguayans. But these are those that live in houses that the survey runs the household level can reach. So the Junta Nacional de Droga kind of measure how many doesn't live at houses or houses that are not reached with the survey because they were in very, very, very poor neighborhoods. So and they they say that for them there are kind of more 11,000 more uncovered by the household survey. So if we put together those that are captured by the household survey and those that are not, so we have around 30,000 daily consumers of marijuana in Uruguay. Here we have the marijuana prevalence. This is data from the Americas Barometer. And I have just already told you 22.1% is the life prevalence. But when we ask how often those consume, 45 said that almost half, no, that just once, it was just once. So maybe they have experimented and tried just once and then they didn't keep up with consuming. 36 says sometimes, and 19 say that they are frequent consumers. Okay. The thing is, if we can trust this data on prevalence, huh? And the answer is yes, and I'm going to tell you why. We have run a LIS experiment, and I'm just going very quick through this, but I can tell you more afterwards if you want. But this is the LIS experiment is a methodology, use a technique to measure sensitive topics while avoiding the social desirability effect. You know that maybe people don't want to say something or declare their behaviors or opinions towards something, so they underreport that. So there is a methodology that has been highly used to measure, for example, racism, clientelism, and drugs consumption. So it was comparing the percentage obtained from a direct question in which we ask if the person consumed drugs or if he like or doesn't like certain kind of people or whatever, with the one obtained with an indirect question. So here we have the questions. I'm not going to get into detail on that, but but that is the way in which the LIS experiment works. So we compare the control group mean with the treatment group mean. The control group mean is the percentage, the prevalence measure that we got from the direct question, with the treatment group mean, that is the result of the prevalence that we got for asking indirectly. So then we subtract one from the other and compare. And at least in March 2014, that was the day in which the new law of marijuana legalization was implemented, no underreporting of marijuana consumption existed in Uruguay. Yeah? 22.1% was the percentage of life prevalence captured by the direct question, and with this experiment, the prevalence that we capture is 22.7%. So this comparison, what indicates is that we can trust on the prevalence data that I have just shown to you, so that this is like real, that we can trust on the data from the Junta Nacional de Drogas that comes from these household surveys. Life prevalence of marijuana in Uruguay in comparison with El Salvador and the US. Miguel has shown you the data about the approval of the regulation, the legalization. But this is the life prevalence in comparison. And you can see, well, I have just told you 22.1% of Uruguayans have tried marijuana, while in El Salvador it's just 11%, and the United States is 58%. So this data has the similar distribution that they support for marijuana legalization. Who consumes? Well, Miguel also explained how to read this kind of graph. You can see the variables on the left, starting from from the one at the top, you can see the role of ideology. This means that people who are on the left tend to consume more. Is a factor that has a significant impact on consuming marijuana. Also, low levels of religiosity. In those that have low levels of religiosity tend to consume more marijuana than those that have higher levels of religiosity. Those who live in Montevideo, in the capital city, too. Young people, those with higher income, and finally male. This is an easy way to see the same information. An Uruguayan that has between 18 and 25 years has a probability of marijuana consumption of 0.49, while if he or she has between 56 and 56 and 65 has a 0.08. So it reduces in a huge amount when you become older. The US consumer profile in comparison, well, similar things, no, being more liberal, also low levels of religiosity, but age is not a significant predictor of consumption. Neither is education or income, but being male is a significant predictor. Males consume more marijuana than females. In sum, data are reliable, so the long series that I have shown you, the ones that starts at the beginning of the 21st century, show that the prevalence have increased, and it has increased in all their forms. I mean, as I have shown you, there are different measures: the life prevalence, the year prevalence, the month prevalence, and all these prevalence types have increased, especially among youth. So one of the findings that this data kind of brings to us is the prevalence increase among youth. And that is what we consider kind of a red flag about the law implementation. And we think that the government should really pay close attention to this. First, because, well, you see that the prevalence among them has doubled during 10 years, but also because the regulation and the legalization for people under 18 doesn't work. I mean, they will remain illegal by consuming. So we think that this is a red flag and something that the implementation of the policy need to focus. So to pay attention on prevention policies. So thanks, and I will leave the floor to Fernanda.
Thank you, Rosario. Good morning. First, I'd like to thank the Latin American and Caribbean Center, and especially Dr. Cruz, for having us here. It's such a pleasure to be here, and especially such a pleasure to be in Miami after a couple of days in DC. So what I'll be talking about this morning is one part of our study, a respondent-driven sample of frequent marijuana consumers. We conducted this study in Montevideo, the metropolitan area. So to begin with, let me tell you a bit about this methodology, right? RDS, the respondent-driven sample, as its name indicates, relies on a change referral mechanism to recruit participants. RDS was developed by Douglas Heckathorn. There is a landmark article in 1997, and it's a method that essentially combines snowball recruitment, where one study participant brings another study participants into the study with a system of weights to account for the non-random nature of the sample. So we can talk more, in more detail about this later. Probably I'll bore you to death if I go into more details right now. But what is really important about this study is that since individuals are recruited by peers, those with largest networks seem to be overrepresented in the sample, so we account for that. So there is a whole system of weights, and statistical procedures to adjust the sample to get reliable results. And we've been crunching data, to show you the results that account for all those mechanisms. Why battering into an RDS while, marijuana consumption is so open in Uruguay, as Rosario was telling? Well, RDS is a method deemed ideal for studying hidden populations, and marijuana consumers aren't that much of a hidden population. First, we have a sampling frame. We have an idea, from the data from public opinion studies, but also for the special studies from the National Drug Board, the Junta Nacional de Drogas. So we have an idea of how many consumers we have. And we also know that they are rather forthcoming about their at least experience with marijuana. However, we conducted a lengthy formative stage study before developing our RDIs. And we realized that even though, individuals are rather open about their experience with marijuana, this didn't grant, however, that they would be, so forthcoming about other behaviors. One thing is admitting that you tried or currently use marijuana, a behavior that, as Emily rightly pointed, has been legal in Uruguay since the 1970s. A different thing is admitting to have cannabis plant at home, right? Or perhaps buying marijuana in the streets, or even selling surplus marijuana from your own plants to friends. And these kind of behaviors were at the very core of our research questions. We needed to dig into more than, just simply, have you ever smoked or not? So the RDS proved to be, the right method to go on. So our study focused, there are the basics. Individuals need to form a social network, of course, because one individual recruits some other. There is a structured incentive, so we gave gift cards for granting the interview, and we also gave them secondary incentives from bringing new eligible participants into the study. For this to work, there is, there needs to be in place a detailed system for tracking the recruitment change, and the study begins with, initial participants that are handpicked by the study. We began with 5, and these initial participants are called seeds, and of course, there is no pun intended, seeds are called, in any other study, in any other RDS study. So let me tell you a bit more about our study. We define our target population as individuals aged 18 or more who live in Montevideo or the Montevideo metropolitan area, and who consume marijuana at least once a week. So first, this is a study of frequent consumers only, and therefore is not representative of all marijuana consumers in Uruguay, not even in Montevideo. And evidence from various studies points to the fact that frequent consumers account for most of the marijuana consumed, as with pretty much any other drug, and they are also the most exposed to risks that might derive from heavy consumption, and therefore they constitute a very important group to study. We concentrated in Montevideo and the metro area, as more than half of the entire country lives there, with roughly 1.6 million inhabitants. Data collection took place at the end of 2014. We reached 294 effective cases. Our target was 300 cases. And for that analysis, we used one of the available software for RDS analysis, the RDS analysis developed by Hancock and his colleagues. So, as I mentioned, the recruitment process worked with 5 seats from diverse backgrounds. Each participant was given 3 coupons to recruit new participants, and this is how our coupons look like. Coupons, had a unique identifier number. They also had an expiration date for individuals not to, procrastinate and never give coupons away to their friends. The coupon also had ways for contacting the research team. I mean, one key element in the RDS methodology is that we didn't reach out for participants. We needed to wait for participants to contact us. So there was you can imagine there was a bit of anxiety involved, especially at the initial stage of the study, but it just worked great. So we provided a phone number, so individuals could either text us or, call us or use WhatsApp, which is, free once you have internet connection. We also provided an email account. We created a Facebook page who proved to be pretty popular as well. And we also provide a Skype, account just in case no one used that. Coupons had two parts because the recruiter needed to keep one part to claim compensations after the persons recruited by him completed the interview. So this is how the recruitment chain works in theory. So for each seat, you give 3 coupons. All these, in theory, come to us in this case, and you give them 3 new coupons to each of those, so the chain spreads. This is how the actual recruitment chain worked. Because, of course, no one recruited not everyone recruited 3 participants. Many of them did anyways, and we can show the data, the details if you're interested. So we have here 5 recruitment trees spreading from each of our seats. For each tree there, the darker green dot indicates the seed, where it all started. And you can see there we had diverse patterns with chains longer, another shorter. And the numbers there are just the ID codes for the cases. We had 3 very successful seeds, 2 other not so much. We reached 13 waves, which is pretty good in terms of getting the sample to stabilize. So we are rather happy with the results. The sample is diverse in terms of gender and also age, and according to other variables as well. So let's go to the data. Respondents to our study are really high frequency users, right? We asked individuals how many days a week they use marijuana. 3 out of 10 use them daily. And then we have, all other sorts of patterns for the rest of possible the days of the week, with only 8.5% using marijuana only once a week. On the days they consume, a vast majority consume a gram or less. Right? 26%, like a quarter of the sample, said they consume less than a gram. Almost 4 out of 10, 37.4%, said they consume 1 gram. So this is for the entire sample. Now, when you break the sample for, how many days a week they consume, and you calculate the average grams consumed, those who smoke, because they mostly smoke marijuana, although there are other ways of consuming it. Those who smoke every day, they consume an average 3 grams or more. And those who use marijuana only once a week, they tend to use an average less than a gram. So yes, there are, this masks the difference between, the really heavy consumers. Self-grow and cannabis clubs are the only legal methods to obtain marijuana in Uruguay nowadays, but we see a lot of individuals purchasing marijuana or have someone purchasing marijuana for them. There are 2 types of marijuana available in the Uruguayan market: pressed marijuana and flowers. And of course, commerce of both is still legal. And let me tell you a bit about those 2 types of marijuana. Pressed marijuana comes almost entirely from Paraguay. It's called prensado, pressed, in reference to the way it's packed. And you can see a picture of a small block of pressed marijuana over there. And it's commonly or popularly referred to as a 25, a 25. And that is because it comes in a package of 25 grams, a bit less than 1 ounce. This smaller, and a 25, un 25 costs around $30 in the market, and the price is pretty stable. Pressed marijuana can also be purchased in smaller quantities, typically by the gram, which is enough for a joint or 2. And these smaller packages cost between $1 and $2, and they are called palancas or handles. And the picture in the upper side of the slide shows a palanca, which is a small bag of marijuana ready to be made into a joint. This marijuana comes from drug trafficking. It's regarded as dirty by most users who claim not to have other choice than purchasing it in the streets. It's deemed by users as low quality and typically low impact, low THC marijuana. And we heard reports of, this marijuana from Paraguay being contaminated with all sorts of chemicals, it's highly disregarded, but it's still consumed because there's nothing else in the market. In addition to the pressed marijuana, individuals report to also purchase flowers. Flowers are the product of local self-growers, right? It can be friends who have plants and have surplus and sell it to other friends, or it can be simply local entrepreneurs who are getting successful at growing their own plants. The market for flowers is smaller, but it is reported to be growing fast. Flowers are much more expensive than pressed marijuana. 25 grams of flowers can easily be paid around $100 in the market, and this higher price reflects both the perceived quality of the product, of course, free of chemicals, for instance, and also the higher levels of THC. The slide that I was just showing before presents all the different ways for accessing marijuana individuals in our study reported to have used during the past 12 months. So, we see a variety of ways to access marijuana there, as you can see, but we also asked the methods of acquisition during the most recent acquisition, because you can access marijuana in a variety of ways, but then we have that, 60% either, bought directly pressed marijuana or had someone buying marijuana for them with an additional, 10% that received pressed marijuana as a gift. And the gift part needs special analysis because two different ways of obtaining cannabis might be at place here. Receiving the marijuana for their own use, like, someone has marijuana and gives you, and you go to your place or wherever and you use marijuana, but also sharing a joint. Some users use a different word for sharing a joint as opposed, to receive marijuana as a gift. Some others don't, so there's more like qualitative work to be done there. But anyway, we also asked them in which ways they consume marijuana. And even when the joint is the most common way of consuming marijuana, Uruguayans are getting creative, with it. A quarter of the high-frequency consumer survey declared to have tried edibles during the last year. And these edibles range from the classic brownies, of course, to fire cookies. I mean, I didn't even know that Nutella was widely available in Uruguay, and consumers report to have fire cookies, made cookies stuffed with Nutella and marijuana, of course. They also report to have consumed marijuana in milkshakes and daiquiris and added to the popular Uruguayan drink of mate, which is a sort of tea. So we could put together a pretty lengthy cookbook out of all the data from the RDS study. When asked about the most popular way of consuming marijuana, the joint is, of course, the winner. We have a ton of other data on the profile of the frequent marijuana consumers, but I'd like to focus now on two key aspects, in our opinion anyways, for the policy-making efforts in Uruguay: risk behaviors and attitudes towards the policy itself. So first, there is no perception of risk about doing some daily activities under the influence of marijuana. I mean, there is no risk perception whatsoever among our frequent consumers. They do it in public spaces, they circulate in the public space under the effects, and of course, a pedestrian under the effects is less of a threat than an intoxicated driver, right? But while eventually everyone is a pedestrian, not everyone drives a car or a motorbike or operates heavy equipment, for God's sake. So this is the percentage of individuals in our sample that report having done any of those activities under the effects at least once in their lifetimes. And we didn't even control for those who actually can drive a car or typically drive a car. So if we have done so, the results would be much higher. So there is more to explore here, but this is at least a warning sign. And of course, while it is virtually impossible to keep an eye on pedestrians, being stoned with marijuana, things are different at work and at education institutions. More than half of our respondents, 55.4% exactly, declared that they consumed marijuana and went to work before 4 hours had passed. which probably means they went to work under the effects, And also, more than 6 out of every 10 interviewees, 62.7%, declared to have attended classes within a time frame of 4 hours after consuming marijuana. Those who went to work after consuming marijuana reported that their performance in the job was either enhanced, 36%, equal, 30%, or worse, 33.5%, compared to when they go to work sober. And it's too bad we didn't ask about the type of work in the study, because this probably explains the variations, right? And we have some anecdotal evidence on this, Individuals who have more creative jobs, they report to do better. Those who also have jobs that need physical effort report to do better. Those who need to keep themselves sharper, not so much. Which makes sense with what was reported by the students, unlike the case of going to work. There is a moderate consensus about the fact that performance diminishes when they go to class under the effects. Almost 64% of respondents felt that way. And we also have data on risk behavior of pregnant women, women during lactation. Those are not encouraging either. We can, discuss about that later, so we can keep, moving on with this presentation. About the attitudes about the law. Okay, the marijuana law is highly popular among frequent consumers. I mean, if the law is not popular among them, who will support it anyways? Almost 9 out of 10 agree with the law, 52% agree, and another 36% agree a lot. The registry system, though, is not that popular, even though a majority of respondents says they were planning to register. Actually, 58% of the high-frequency consumers from the metro area plan to register. But, that is the glass half full for the policy implementation. A majority plans to register, but 4 out of 10 are not planning to register. We have, a 20% saying, hell no, I'll never make it to the registry, and another 20% saying they will probably not make it to the registry. So we asked them why. Those who say they weren't planning on registering, we asked them why was that. And rejection to the registry has mostly to do with the perceived opportunity cost. Why would they do it if there is no benefit involved and there are risks? So for instance, unless they plan to purchase marijuana in pharmacies, the registry is not necessary to acquire marijuana. You can either keep growing your own plants at home, as you have done for 25 years, 10 years, you name it, or you can keep purchasing marijuana in the black market. So unless you are really thinking of acquiring marijuana in the pharmacies, there is no practical effect for you in becoming a registered user. Even more, if you're a cultivator, let's say, being registered means the government knows you grow marijuana. It means the government knows your address. And, it means that they can come and pay a visit just to check on your plants. So if you have more plants than those allowed, for instance, you are at risk. So individuals perceive there's really no gains in being registered. Also, opposition to the registry has to do with a normative concern, right? 20% rejected because they do not believe there should be a register of marijuana consumers. They argue that there is no registry of beer drinkers or, tobacco smokers, and if marijuana is a legal substance, just as beer and tobacco, why there would be a need for a registry? So these are probably the hardcore opponents to the registry because they have like a philosophical opposition to it, and these are going to be the users that probably will never make it. And finally, another fifth of respondents, another 20%, object the registry out of fear. They don't trust the registry to be period confidential, so they are concerned about, getting a job in the future, the registry being hacked by, who knows, the opposition, drug dealers. So they don't oppose the idea of the registry, but the way it's being implemented. So maybe these individuals might be convinced to become registry use with a proper communication strategy. However, the controversial pharmacy selling is the preferred method for those who plan to register. Almost 6 out of 10 of those who say they will surely or probably will become registered users mention the pharmacy as their preferred method for registering. And one interesting thing we found during fieldwork was that many individuals didn't know they had to pick only one way to access marijuana. So when we asked them, okay, so will you plan to register as a self-grower or, as a member of a cannabis club or a pharmacy? They were like, oh, all of them. Like, no, you can't. And many of them were puzzled. Many of them even became angry because, as we just saw at the beginning of my part of the presentations, individuals access marijuana through a variety of ways. If they are just beginning to become, cultivators, they might not be very successful at it, or they might have plans that don't provide them with enough supplies for an entire year. So they want to be able to rely on a second mechanism of access. But as the law establishes things right now, you cannot. I mean, you are either a consumer through a pharmacy, or you will become, because that is not in place, as Emily clearly explained earlier, or you are a self-grower, or you are a member of a cannabis club. So in sum, law implementations will face many challenges, especially individuals, as I said, rely on more than one method to acquire marijuana despite the provision of the law. So they will either need to change their behavior to adapt it, or just ignoring the law altogether, as some of them plan to do. There is a rejection to the registry for a variety of reasons, which are more or less difficult to tackle, but with a proper communication strategy, some of those might be overcome. And finally, but not less important, there is little perception of risk among consumers who perform a variety of activities under the influence. This is not only a matter of self-preservation, not even only a matter of public health. It is also linked to labor laws and controls and sanctions and a whole new line of actions that need to be designed and implemented. Because as Emily also was saying earlier this morning, Uruguay is sort of starting from the scratch, and there is a whole new set of regulations that need to be thought of and implemented and developed and tested. And in a way, we feel that all these findings, these key challenges, point to the same problem, which is related to the fact that strong prevention and communication programs need to be put in place. It is not that prevention is not part of the law. I mean, there is actually a whole section on the law on prevention, but that yet needs to be fully implemented. There have been prevention strategies within the frame of broader drug prevention strategies in Uruguay, and they long precede the marijuana regulation law. But it seems there needs to be more prevention efforts to counterbalance the effect that the whole regulation process is having, especially in youth consumers. And also communication programs need to be put in place, because most of the communications that favorable towards the law has been done not by the government, but from the coalition of activists. And individuals don't receive the information in the same way when it doesn't come from the government. So that'll be it for our part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Fernanda. Let me invite in our discussions, Hannah Hetzer to provide us with her comments on the study.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you to FIU for having invited us. I can't tell you how good it feels to get out of the Northeast winter despair. I mean, we're really starting to hate ourselves in the world, so this is lovely. I work for the Drug Policy Alliance. I'm the policy manager of the Americas. Our organization works on drug policy reform in three major categories: marijuana regulation, criminal justice reform, and health approaches and harm reduction. And I was very lucky to spend 2013 in Uruguay working on the campaign to regulate marijuana with the Uruguayan government and with Uruguayan civil society organizations. And what Uruguay did in 2013 was embark on something truly historic in becoming the first country to regulate the production and sale of marijuana. This comes against the backdrop of increasing concern with our current drug policies, and increasing consensus that the war on drugs is failing, the policies of the past decades aren't working, and increasing calls for alternatives, especially from Latin America, which has, to a large part, borne the brunt of our repressive policies. So this was, there were other Latin American presidents that had come out on the world stage, like the president of Colombia and the president of Guatemala, calling for an alternative to the war on drugs. What that alternative is in their mind, they haven't quite established. But throughout that time, President Mujica had remained quite silent, and Uruguay had kept out of the international discussion to a large extent. And then in 2012, Mujica kind of surprised everyone in the world and even within his own party by announcing this proposal to regulate marijuana. And it became worldwide news. I think it is important to highlight this growing kind of momentum in the Americas, in our hemisphere, on the marijuana front. The U.S. now has 4 states with legal marijuana: Washington, Colorado, Alaska, and Oregon. But this difference on the public opinion side, where in the U.S. this is driven by the public. These have all been done through ballot initiatives. We haven't managed to get marijuana regulation through any legislature. And so in the U.S. it's pushed by the public, and politicians are pretty much lagging behind and starting to catch up, but are pretty reticent for now. Whereas in Latin America, the public remains a little bit more skeptical, and the debate is coming from the political elite, academic elite, and then some civil society groups that are mobilizing around this. So in Uruguay, Mujica gets a lot of credit for being the one to push this forward, but there was this group within Uruguay that had been increasingly organizing marijuana marches every year, and had been working with legislatures even in 2010 to present a bill on autocultivo, domestic cultivation, which just remained stuck in Parliament and was never passed, and then kind of got added to this regulation bill. So there, Mujica gave it its prominence, and it could not have happened without Mujica, but he did have this feeling of support from certain groups in Uruguay and certain legislators that had already said they would be in favor of this. So we did kind of in collaboration with the government, but with this group of 10 different Uruguayan civil society organizations, a campaign on this issue. Because the problem had been that there had been a lot of political work put into the marijuana regulation and forming and drafting the bill, so it was as comprehensive as possible. But the public opinion was still very low, and there was very little information about the bill. So it was all over the news, but what it actually meant, what regulation of marijuana actually meant for the public, was very misunderstood. So we created, a campaign and did our own research, which kind of corresponds nicely with the research that has been done by our colleagues here. And we did some focus groups, and what we found from the focus group, first of all, that was, age is a huge factor. People over 40 were so adamantly against this issue. And the younger people tended to be a lot more open. But another major factor that we found was, despite opposition, when asked about the specifics of the bill or what it actually meant, people had no idea, and really didn't know what the government was trying to do with this, what the bill would actually look like. And some of the civil society groups had been framing it for themselves as this issue of personal freedom, in conjunction and following on from the issues of marriage equality and abortion. But those arguments tested horribly in our research, and because everyone, people who support marijuana reform have their own set of arguments on why they want to see this passed, but those might not be the arguments that resonate most with the actual public, and so then we did a nationwide poll, face-to-face poll of 815 respondents in April 2013. And what we found was, very low support, so 25% in favor, 62% opposed, yet flexible opinions. So when presented with the specifics of the bill, A and B arguments in favor of the bill, 4 out of 10 Uruguayans were prone to positively change their position. Obviously, wording regulation was more accepted than legalization. Knowledge about the content of the law matters, and messages matter. Similarly to what this group found, support for marijuana was higher among men, people living in the capital, under 40 years old, and of a left-wing ideology. Then when we presented the specifics of the bill, and whether people viewed them as more positive or more negative, what is not surprising is the aspects that were most restrictive, prohibiting sales to minors, prohibiting driving under the influence, prohibiting advertising, those were viewed most positively. And the aspects that were looked at as more favorable to marijuana consumption or growth or cultivation were looked at more negatively, like the domestic cultivation of 6 plants, which is the same number as you can have in Colorado, and the cannabis social clubs. Then, in terms of the messages and what resonated within the arguments, the government did really take on this singular line of, we're doing this to fight drug trafficking and do away with the black market for marijuana. And that had been, the government's repeated line, but it actually didn't come first in terms of what was most supported among the population. The public health argument was actually ranked the most positively and the highest, and that's that, marijuana has some medical use and could be used in the treatment of users of pasta base, which is kind of a nasty sort of cocaine paste. And then obviously the selling to minors, the limiting the black market were important factors. And then this kind of Uruguayan, unique Uruguayan issue of the fact that it had been decriminalized. So people were allowed to use marijuana, and it is pretty prevalently used. And there isn't a big prison population of people who use marijuana or possess marijuana. It's not like the mass incarceration system that we have in the United States. So it wasn't also a huge leap. But there was this access, which was the use was available, but the access to it was illegal, which did nothing but promote a black market. And that was responded to very positively among the population as well. So, it isn't to be expected that the government would put this proposal out there and have immediate support from the population. This is a gradual thing, and the more information they have about it, there is a trend upward in positive responses. And what we can see is also, from the beginning of when this was proposed in 2012 and the research showing 25% of the population supported, to now a year and a half later, 2 years later, it has gone up to, I think it's 34% in your research. So that's a pretty significant jump in a short time. And it is likely, what we do actually see with a lot of other political issues is implementation matters. And when it becomes a reality, people start to accept it and then follow the implementation. And there is a trend in an uphill trend in support for these measures. But it is going to be, despite not over 50% of the population being in support of it, this measure is going to be implemented. And the government has already remained committed to it. The incoming government, though the new president he's not a mujica. He's not going to go on, lengthy tirades about why this is necessary, but he is committed to executing it. And right now we stand at a year and a half from the approval. There is the cannabis social clubs, and I think maybe around 20 have registered, of up to 45 members so far. There is the domestic cultivation, where I think under 2,000 people have registered. And then the two more elements of the law that are still going to be implemented are the license sales in pharmacies, where they are waiting to give the production licenses to 4 or 5 companies to do this for the government, and then the medical marijuana. In the U.S., a lot of the states that approved recreational marijuana did it on the back of their medical marijuana systems. Uruguay never had medical marijuana, so it's building this in with the law. And they've taken a little bit longer on that because it has some extra complications and some extra issues to deal with. So the regulations for the medical marijuana market just came out. So probably sometime in the next year, we'll start to see that happening. And there have been, some voices of concern about why Uruguay is moving slowly on this. Why hasn't it happened yet? I would say it's better that they move with caution and move slowly to make sure that they get it right. And if you compare it to Washington and Colorado, the difference there is that Washington and Colorado from the beginning had laid out a timeline and said, okay, we will have it in stores at this date, a year and a half later. And they kept it. Uruguay never laid out a timeline. They left themselves flexible. And it still has only been a year and a half. So it's not, the sky isn't falling because they haven't done it yet. I think they're taking their time and trying to do it right, which is probably better than not. I think so. The research presented by our colleagues here highlights some very important challenges in the implementation of this law, especially with respect to frequent consumers, and with regards to their perception of risk and the registering. So just a note on the registering, because that's such a contentious issue and was talked about a lot. In the political debate about including a user registry or not, there was a lot of back and forth. And in the U.S., in the recreational states, there is no user registry, but Uruguay is doing this on a national context, and they have to deal with certain geopolitical realities. And they were getting some concern from their neighbors, Argentina and Brazil, on what if Uruguayan marijuana passes into our borders and gets trafficked. So it was kind of to assuage some of those concerns that we will make it to 40%. 40 grams a month was important for them to lay out, because it alleviates concerns about the trafficking to other countries and these things like prohibiting to minors, prohibiting the amount of quantity you can have, which people who are not marijuana consumers tend to like those aspects more, and it's more comforting to them. And the only way you can limit those is by having some sort of user registry. So it was included, for this geopolitical reality, and also to comfort some of the people who did not support marijuana regulation in general. But there has also been, from the government, they've been very open about the fact that if things aren't working, if certain elements of the bill aren't working, they will change that down the line, and that there will be flexibility on it. So the user registry will be maintained, but who knows, in 5 years, 10 years, perhaps we will be in a situation where it can look more like the alcohol model, if that is what the Uruguayans and the Uruguayan context requires. So on these challenges that have been presented, it's easy to look at them negatively, but they also present opportunities for the government to reach these frequent users and high-risk populations. But I think it's always important to remember in any evaluation of the results and any evaluation of the success of Uruguay's model is what you're comparing it to. And what you're comparing it to was the baseline of drug prohibition, which we know hasn't worked. It hasn't managed to decrease or eliminate consumption. The numbers of increasing use, those are taken from 2001 to 2014. That's not within the last 2 years. There has been this upward trend for over a decade, and that was before marijuana regulation ever happened. So there are certain things, and there are certain things that happen with or without marijuana regulation, and actually prohibition might incite even further, like use the black market, obviously. So the question really in evaluating it is not, it should not be, is this the silver bullet that's going to solve all drug-related problems, all marijuana-related problems? It absolutely won't. But will it be a step in the positive direction, and will it alleviate some problems that were present under prohibition? And is it better than prohibition? So obviously many factors need to be included in assessing that, and the most obvious one is marijuana use. Did it go up or down? But that's not the only one. We also have to look at problematic use of marijuana, problematic use of other drugs. Are there substitution effects happening? Driving under the influence, treatment, black market related crime. The list goes on, and there definitely needs to be a holistic evaluation of this experiment, because if we're just going to take use rates, it's not going to be very representative of whether this is a successful model or not. And in terms of the registering of consumers and domestic cultivators, it's easy to say, there's a couple months into this registry, there are only 2,000 people who have registered. Yet that's 2,000 more that are now in the legal system that weren't in the legal system before. Before marijuana regulation, the entire market was illicit. So when the government is faced with the question of, do you think this will completely eliminate the black market for marijuana or other drugs? Usually they say, no, that's an impossibility. But our intent is to reduce it as much as possible around marijuana specifically. And if we look at other psychoactive or harmful substances like alcohol and tobacco, the black market is very small. It still exists, but it's much smaller than, under alcohol prohibition in the 20s and 30s. And so with marijuana, before regulation, 100% of the market was illicit. With each user that joins the registry, buys from a pharmacy, that's one user less that's going to the black market. So I think the government's aim is to reduce as much as possible, reduce to 30%, 20%, 10%, 5% the black market around this and the associated problems. But the government will really have to work on certain elements. They can't just pass this law and just kind of let it slide and see what happens. They have to actively work on encouraging people to sign up to the registry, ensuring that people understand that data is confidential, and I understand the fears around it, but it is treated. It's not going to be on some internet list where everyone can access. This is confidential data just for the government, and that there will be no repercussions for anyone who joins it now or in the future. And they also need to work very, very strongly on public education campaigns, because that's really one of the only ways that you can diminish use, and you can diminish, you can increase perception of risks, diminish risky behavior. And the government has had a couple of campaigns over the past couple of years. But a benefit of this marijuana regulation system is it provide increased tax revenue to be able to put towards those systems. But there definitely needs to be encouragement for the government to continue and definitely to focus on people who are most engaging in marijuana use most riskily and most frequently. And the advantage, I guess, in terms of bringing people into the legal system is that the marijuana on the black market is of a terrible quality, and the fact that most people do buy this, prensada, this Paraguayan junk that people don't like, but it's their only way of accessing if they're not producing at home, and cultivating at home is not particularly easy. It's not like everyone's going to start growing, producing beer at home just because they can. So the government has that advantage, I'd say more than in the States, that the quality of the marijuana on the black market was so low, and they're offering better quality at a comparative price, so that's enticing people to join the legal system. So this law will be evaluated over the next decade and more, and that's why it's so important to have continued monitoring and evaluation to study the effects of this law. And that's why research such as this is so important, because the government needs to be flexible, and it's already said it's going to be flexible. It's a trial and error process. They're creating a new market, or taking a market from where it was illegal and make it licit. And this is going to be trial error. There are going to be some things that work great from the beginning, and some things that they're going to need to change going forward. But the only way they can do that is if they have the data and if they have this monitoring and evaluation system. And increasingly, more and more countries are going to look to Uruguay. They're also going to look to the United States. But in Latin America, I think the proximity of the issues that Uruguay is dealing with has alerted a lot of interest in other Latin American countries. And there's no Latin American country that is yet on the verge of passing something like Uruguay is, but there's a lot of debate now in Latin America, more on medical marijuana than on this. And in Colombia, in Chile, in Mexico, in Puerto Rico, in Jamaica, there's now all of those have bills or initiatives on medical marijuana. The presidents are speaking out more and more. People are aware that this war on drugs has not brought nothing but bloodshed. So there is this look to something else, and what that something else is, Uruguay has provided one example, and if they can show that this is a better alternative to drug prohibition, I think more and more countries will start to adopt similar measures based on their context. And I'll finish with saying that the Uruguayan law looks very different to the U.S. marijuana laws. The U.S. versions are much more commercialized because we're in the United States, and so if you have the image of what Colorado looks like, Uruguay will not look like that. It's going to be much more government regulation. There's a total ban on all types of advertising of marijuana or marijuana-regulated products, both directly and indirectly. There's not going to be the same diversification of products and the kind of whole edible scene that you have here. It'll be a smaller, more restricted, less advertised, less commercial model, which I think will provide a very different and interesting counterexample to learn from in comparison to the US. So just going forward on this, historical implementation in Uruguay, I think we should all be looking out for it, learning our lessons, and continue to follow research such as this that tells us whether this is a better alternative to what we have now, which is not working. So, thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. We'll hear now Bo Kilmer.
Well, good morning. It is very much an honor to be here and participate in such an important discussion. I'm a researcher at the RAND Corporation, where we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization that really tries to improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. And at RAND, I co-direct our Drug Policy Research Center, where we work on a variety of issues related to substance use and drug policy. Some of my colleagues are developing prevention programs for schools and communities. Others are trying to figure out which treatment modalities work best for different types of addictive disorders. Do a fair amount in terms of the intersection between drug policy and the criminal justice system. We also do a lot in terms of looking at the economics of these markets and policy analysis. I've personally been doing a lot of work in the area of marijuana legalization over the past 10 years. And I want to make it very clear that RAND doesn't have an official position on marijuana policy. We really are just trying to provide the research that can help inform these discussions. And just to kind of put this all in perspective, I mean, what's happening now truly is unprecedented. I mean, you've heard bits and pieces from the other speakers, but it was in November of 2012 when the voters in Colorado and Washington, they not only voted to remove the prohibition on marijuana, they actually voted to allow for-profit companies to come in and begin producing. And then it wasn't until December of 2013 that Uruguay became the first country in the world to experiment with legalization. Now, this actually confused a lot of people, because a lot of people think that marijuana was already legalized in the Netherlands. But that's not the case. Yes, if you're over 18, you can walk into one of those coffee shops and buy up to 5 grams, because they have an official policy of not enforcing the law against small-scale transactions. So you can kind of think about it being legal in the front door. However, it's still illegal to grow and sell marijuana to those coffee shops. So it's actually illegal in the back door, meaning there's still a black market there. And so this is important because if you're trying to make projections about, well, what's marijuana legalization going to look like in the United States? Or what's it going to look like in Uruguay? Or what's it going to look like in other places? We can't just look to the Netherlands to get insights. And so that's why research here is so important. And so I'm honored to be participating in this discussion. And it really is important that Uruguay is collecting the baseline data that you need in order to be able to understand what's happening in the country. And in particular, when Maria Fernanda was presenting about the respondent-driven sampling, I mean, this is a very innovative approach for getting information from the frequent users. As she mentioned, this is the group that accounts for most of the consumption. In some of the work that I've done for the White House here in the United States, we actually were looking at how much marijuana was consumed throughout the country and who actually is using it. And it turns out that 20% of the users account for 80% of the consumption. So it's those people that admit to using in the past month or being daily or near daily users. They account for all of the vast majority of consumption. So that's a group you really want to pay close attention to. And sometimes when you're doing these general population surveys, you're not necessarily getting that group. So I was thrilled to see, the information that we have already. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to do this, but it would be great to be able to go back to those same individuals. You are? Oh, because there are issues in terms of privacy. But I'm thrilled because this is going to be really important, kind of going back to them over time to kind of find out how their use patterns changed, how their acquisition patterns have changed. So I really think other countries or other states that are experimenting with changes in marijuana policies could look to this as an example. I was also thrilled, Jose Miguel, you showed it up on the on one of your initial slides, but it wasn't necessarily in the summary, about the research that you're going to be doing on the cannabis clubs. And I'm really excited to kind of learn more about this, because especially in the United States, the debate about marijuana policy really is a binary. People either talk about prohibition or they're talking about the for-profit alcohol model. But realize that's a false dichotomy. If you're a jurisdiction and you're thinking about doing something other than prohibiting marijuana, you have a number of options. There's a lot of policy space there. For example, you could allow just home production. You could allow the cannabis clubs. You could limit production and distribution to nonprofits or socially responsible businesses. Or you could perhaps even have a state monopoly. Now that state monopoly, that doesn't necessarily get a lot of attention in the United States because of the federal prohibition. And if a state were to actually kind of go down this path, they would be putting their employees at risk of violating federal law. But outside the United States, this does actually get a lot more attention in terms of options. But I do think getting insights about the cannabis clubs, I mean, there hasn't been much research done on this in Spain. And in Spain, the model isn't as regulated as it's supposed to be in Uruguay. So I think there's a lot we're going to be able to learn from that. So I look forward to kind of seeing that research as it comes out. But if you're thinking about evaluating these cannabis policy changes, there are a number of factors you're going to want to think about. And I want to highlight four before we open it up for Q&A. And the first thing you need to think about when you're reading newspaper articles about this, or you're actually doing the research, is what's your control group going to be? And that is, I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to see people look at, if you're looking at Uruguay and saying, wow, here's what was happening with a pasta base consumption in 2014. Here's what's happening with it in 2016. Whether it goes up or whether it goes down, you can imagine some people attributing that change to marijuana legalization. Maybe if there's an increase, some people will say maybe it's because there was a gateway effect. If there was a decrease, some people may say, well, people are just substituting away from pasta base toward marijuana. But the bottom line is that if you do see this change, whether it be in pasta base or at crime or any other factor, just because it happened between 2014 and 2016 doesn't mean that it's attributable to marijuana legalization. There could have been a lot of other things happening in the region. So that's why when you're reading these articles or you're doing the research, you want information about, well, what's happening in other nearby cities or other nearby countries, so you can try to really try to identify whether or not it's because of marijuana legalization or something else. And in fact, we're seeing this here in the United States with Colorado already with respect to crime. And people looking at what happened with crime in Denver in 2013 versus 2014, and it turns out depending on what crime statistics you look at, you can tell a story. But regardless of which direction it's going, if you really want to get insights about this, you need to look beyond Denver there. You need to have a comparison group. So if you're going to be consuming this information, be looking for that. And also, if you're in conversations with people, whether it be in your dorms or at dinner parties, and they say, oh, I read this article that this happened in Colorado or this happened in Uruguay, push them on this. Say, well, what was the counterfactual there? How do we know that that was actually attributable to marijuana legalization versus something else? The second point I want to make, and was sort of alluded to earlier, is with respect to honesty and reporting. When people are going to be evaluating these policy changes, a lot of folks are going to be looking at that prevalence data. Did use go up? Did use especially go up amongst youth? But the thing you have to keep in mind is that with a change in legal regime, it could increase the probability that people are being more honest. And this is especially a concern here in the United States. If you see an increase in prevalence in Colorado or Washington, it's not entirely clear about whether or not it's because of the, things happening because of the policy change with respect to price or availability. It could be that just people are being more honest. This is something you really need to have to think about, especially in the United States, where we spend tens of millions of dollars surveying people about this each year. They used to do work. They used to fund research where then they would actually validate these surveys, where after they would give the survey to a certain number of individuals, then they would just drug test them. I mean, the drug test wasn't given to anyone, but that information then was used to help people understand, well, to what extent are people lying? Now, that work hasn't happened in the United States for quite some time, and we need to see more of this so we can get a better idea. When Rosario was talking about her list experiment, that was really interesting. There was only a short paragraph about that in the report, and I look forward to learning more. It would be interesting to see how similar the rates are for past month use. I don't know if you're able to do that, because that's one of the issues, that past month or even past week use. That would be interesting to kind of see the differences there. So I look forward to reading more about this. But this is something that for jurisdictions that see or that think that they may be kind of going down this path, this is the type of information you want to have beforehand. You want to know kind of how honest are people before they kind of before the policy change. So then over time you can get a better idea about what's actually happening. The third point I want to make is with respect to getting information about price. Price information is really important. I mean, price not only influences kind of what happens with revenues, which is more of an issue here in the United States than in Uruguay, but price is important because it influences consumption. We know that users and potential users are sensitive to the price. So if you're trying to figure out what's happening, kind of with these new regimes, you want to really pay attention to what happens to the price. But realize marijuana is not a homogeneous product. There's different levels of THC. There's other cannabinoids. I mean, there are other ways. It's not just the flower material. You've got your e-cigarettes now, and you've got your patches, and so one of the things that I think is going to be important to consider is not just the price for marijuana, but the price per unit of THC. Granted, there's a lot of other things, and Hannah talked about this a little bit in terms of kind of other products or other pesticides or things that you're going to want to think about that are actually in what's being consumed right now. But thinking about things about how the price per unit of THC changes, that's going to be important for kind of considering how the policy is actually influencing what's happening in the market. And so that's why it's important early on, before the changes occur, to not only get information on what people are paying, but then actually getting information about what they're consuming. So there's some, I just read reviewed an article a little while ago about some researchers in France. And what they did is they went out and started talking to a bunch of heavy users, but then they actually, paid them and actually took some of their, the marijuana that they're consuming. They got all the information on how much they paid, and then they used that and then they took a sample, and then they went and tested it. So that way they could get a better idea about the price, not just the price, but the price per unit of THC. So this is something it's going to be really important, and I'm hoping that, especially within the United States, we start paying more attention to this. The final point I want to make, and this is something that Hannah alluded to as well, is when you're evaluating what happens, there are a number of things you're going to want to look at. You don't want to just look at marijuana prevalence. You also want to look at what happens with respect to marijuana dependence and those that have problems with their consumption. But you're also going to want to pay really close attention to what happens to the use of other substances. Because right now we really don't have a good idea about whether or not, especially with marijuana and alcohol, are they economic complements? Are people more likely to use them together, or are they substitutes? I mean, even before legalization happened, there really wasn't a consensus there. But overall, if you're trying to really figure out what the public health implications are of this legal change, you're going to pay close attention to it. And you're going to want information not just on whether or not someone used in the past month, alcohol in the past month, but the frequency of their drinking, co-occurring drinking, because that's one of the issues too. Is if people are more likely to use them together, that really doesn't run a risk with especially the issue of driving under the influence. In general, driving drunk is worse than driving stoned, but driving stoned is worse than driving sober. But you really run into risks when people are under the influence. Most of the research indicates that. But you really run into a risk when the research indicates that when people are under the influence of both alcohol and marijuana together, that really can increase the probability of getting into an accident. So this is information that you're going to want to get, and it may require actually changing some of the surveys that are already being administered. But for jurisdictions that are thinking about this, these are changes they can make now. So that's one of the things we're realizing, that as we're trying to evaluate these changes, we're realizing that a lot of the tools that we have right now aren't necessarily that useful or aren't necessarily adequate for really projecting what's happening. So we're going to have to begin changing some of the information we collect. My final point is that reasonable people can disagree about what to do with marijuana. I mean, a lot of this comes down to individuals, different values or morals. Also, people just tend to put different weight on different types of outcomes. And also, there's just a lot of uncertainty. Like I said, no one's done this before, so we really don't know how this is going to play out. But for me personally, I'm going to be paying really close attention to what happens in Uruguay, and also looking at the research in Colorado and in Washington and in Oregon and in Washington, D.C. and Alaska and other places. And I'm going to use that information to inform my views about marijuana and marijuana policy. And I hope you'll do the same. So that'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Bo. We're going to open the floor to questions. I'll ask you to use the mics that are in the aisles. Please identify yourself and try to be short and concise with the question. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Jeff Wally. I'm a PhD student at FIU. Thank you so much. I guess my question is kind of to that last point that you made about the other substances. I guess if you guys could just take a minute to talk about the problem, like the prevalence of drug abuse outside of marijuana in Uruguay, and just kind of along those same lines of, it seems like a small percentage of residents, citizens, have used marijuana. So like, I guess one of the things that I've noticed is like folks that haven't used or don't know anybody that uses, they kind of lump all drugs together. So just kind of talk about that, about how, I guess, as people, it's kind of more out in the open and people, are able to say, yeah, I use marijuana, how that will kind of change things, or I don't know if that made sense. But.
We're going to take questions and then we're going to answer. So let's go here.
All right. Thank you. Very enthralling panel and discussion. My name is Dr. Michael Barnett. I'm a visiting scholar at LACC here at FIU. First thing I want to say is give a perspective, a slight paradigm shift. And I must admit, it's going to be a biased one because it's coming from a Rastafari perspective, who consider marijuana to be essentially sacred and something that in itself was given to mankind, womankind, and is separate from other substances and is not to be compared with cocaine and narcotics. In fact, I'll go further that it is not considered a narcotic by and large in Jamaica, and I think it is wrong for it to be grouped with the other drugs. So let's examine that. The key thing is as well that the attitudes towards marijuana, I think, I'm coming as a social scientist now, are subjective and not scientific, because in fact it was legal. The use of marijuana was legal both in the US up till the late 1930s, and then all of a sudden it becomes illegal. We have to examine why. What are the motivations for making it illegal? The same in Jamaica. It was legal up until the late 30s, then it becomes illegal. So this notion of it being as a dangerous drug and a narcotic drug, this is sensationalism for whatever reason. Now I must put forward a perspective, it's my perspective, but I believe it's the tobacco companies acting in their interests to marginalize the use of marijuana, because people who tend to smoke marijuana tend not to smoke tobacco. And I believe mainly for commercial self-interest groups have sidelined marijuana and made it illegal. Now, what's happening now is some of the tobacco giants and so forth have realized with regularization of herb and marijuana that they could have a part of the market. So from a capitalistic perspective, with a little creative thinking, you can diversify and get a share of the profits. And this is where I come to Uruguay as an interesting model, because I believe that the pharmaceutical operation is fully commercialized, and you take on a capitalist model, you can drive out the black market or reduce it significantly because you just outprice, or rather underprice, the marijuana in comparison to what it's sold on the street. If the sale price is significantly less, by getting enough consumers, you will make a profit at the end of the day. So you have a price war. And in Jamaica, what is interesting is we're looking at decriminalization. So we're still miles away from legalization. And I heard somebody mention the issue of Jamaica already. And the reality is Jamaica has been inspired by what's been happening in the US, truth be told. Because for years, despite the presence of Rastafari, who have advocated the free use, and unrestricted use of marijuana, that still has not had an impact on the actual national policy of Jamaica, as we know, and it's only recently, with the changes that have happened in the US, that we have a change of opinion or perspective from the government towards the use of marijuana now. We're moving towards decriminalization. But the real question I want to put to the panel is, in the context of regulation and increased liberalization then of the use of marijuana in Uruguay, if this will have, or if there are any signs of increased, the economy, the general economical impact to the country and the nation as a whole, and what does it do about the national ethos, spirit, I don't know, attitudes to life? Are people more positive, people feeling more negative? Being that in reality it's a governmental-led policy, are people coming around to this policy? Because actually this is what I picked up, which is interesting, because I assumed wrongly that majority of the people were in favor of legalization, but I have learned the different perspective, which is different than Jamaican
Yeah.
suburbs. So if you could shed some light on that, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I see.
Astrid Raraz. Congratulations. I really love the panel, the presentations. I learned so much from all of you. It's having like a field day. I love Uruguay. I think your study is going to be very useful, not only for scholars, but also for policymakers and for the government of Uruguay. And as you clearly pointed out, there are many red flags or words of caution or challenges that the government is going to face with the implementation of the law. My questions is, well, I have a couple of questions, but one of them is, what are the conversations, the debate within the government? Are they taking these words of caution into consideration? I know it's very recent, but are they thinking about them ahead of time? Are you planning to make policy recommendations for the government? Also, as Anna Herzog pointed out very clearly, and some of the presenters, Tabaré, the new president, is not Jose Mujica. He's more conservative, although they're from the same coalition on the left. And he inherited this law. He has like a lukewarm, tibio acceptance, commitment. So I wonder if you envision that he might change the law. He might even become more radical and just find a way of eliminating the law under his government. Also, are you planning to extend your study to the interior of Uruguay? Because I know you're concentrating in the metropolitan area, Montevideo. Also, are you planning to add on your study questions like, are you consuming during your work, not before going to work, going before school? Is the law allowing people in any workplace to consume marijuana? And does that present a challenge to companies or workplaces? And lastly, the resistance that people have to the registry. You didn't mention this, but I wonder if there's any connection with the legacies of the past, of the authoritarian regime, where people in Uruguay were classified as ABC, and maybe there's some resistance about that past. Thank you very much, and good luck with your project.
I don't want to leave anybody standing, so I want to get these questions and then we'll respond. So, yeah.
Yeah, hi, my name is Nicholas. I'm a first-year PhD student in IR here at FIU. Thanks so much for bringing this important discussion to FIU, and also to FIU and LACC for taking the lead in this discussion and research on this topic. I have two very, very small questions. Your data pointed out very clearly that especially young people and people who have experience with marijuana are much more open to legalization. Do you think that legalization and regulation is sort of the future model? Do you think that there is an almost inevitable push in that direction? And the second question is more related to the regional context. And Hannah pointed out that Brazil and Argentina in particular are worried about marijuana flows to their countries. But you also see signs from these two countries that they are following the model and they are maybe thinking about implementing something similar, given that they suffer from very similar sets of problems. We have the spread of criminal organizations. In both countries, we have very high consumption of cocaine and pasta base. So I'm very curious if you have also the other members of the panel, if you have any hints about the reactions in these two countries in particular. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I just changed my mind. We're going to try to respond to this question. I'm sorry, I'm going to leave you standing for a while. But yeah, there are many questions here. So, Maria Fernanda, you want to start and then?
Sure. Thank you for your questions. Okay, about the data on other drugs use, the National Drug Board, la Junta Nacional de Drogas, fortunately, has collected data on use of a variety of drugs, legal and illegal drugs, for youth through the study of high school students and also within the entire population through the Encuesta Nacional de Hogares sobre el Consumo de Drogas. What we do know is that, fortunately, consumption of pasta base, coca paste, is going down after a peak, early in the 2000s. But one of the most worrying concerns is that consumption of alcohol among youth is going up, and also risk consumption, like high consumption, risky behavior. So that is one of the key findings from the most recent collected data. Consumption of tobacco, though, among youth is going down, and in the entire population is going down, which sort of proves that the aggressive policy against tobacco consumption is finally paying off. So we have, mixed data about the effectiveness of the policies, but also some hints about what could be done both in the area of, alcohol consumption and also marijuana consumption among the youth. I'll just go through some of Astrid's questions, and I'll let the rest of the panel answer the rest. There's been debate within the government, and actually, as Hannah was pointing out, the Mujica initiative took part of the government by surprise, which, is not unlikely at all. It has not been unlikely at all during the Mujica administration anyways. But they are taking this very serious. I mean, the Junta Nacional de Drogas, the Observatorio Uruguayo de Drogas, they are really concerned about monitoring. The government itself, they have set a panel of experts to monitor and follow the law. They are constantly redefining the scope of the law and the scope of the regulation. So yes, they are taking this very seriously, and they are engaging in several efforts to measure and, to control that. It's really hard to do because, as several of our panelists today say, they are starting from the scratch, and there's no evidence of any other country doing something like this. And the tobacco and alcohol model are not something the government decided to follow, as Bob was pointing out, was the case in Colorado. So they are still, adapting to the new situation. But we need to dig more into, behavior at work. There is a whole line of regulation that needs to be developed there. We have pretty clear laws for, alcohol consumption at work or tobacco smoking at work, but pretty much as things stand right now, the same laws that apply to tobacco consumption at work will apply for marijuana. So you are not allowed to go to work under the effects, and you are not allowed, of course, to smoke or use marijuana in any other form while at work.
Just to sum to Fernanda's comment on the prevalence on other drugs, and this thing that the consumption of tobacco has decreased, and we think, and this is just also the government perspective, that the reduction on tobacco consumption is also, is produced partially due to the association of tobacco is an unhealthy thing. So you can see within kids, among young people, it is pretty common to have the idea, very clear idea, that to smoke tobacco is unhealthy, and the relationship between tobacco and cancer and other problems are pretty straight. So it was a huge campaign regarding that, so a successful one. So that's the explanation of the reduction of tobacco consumption. It's not the same with the alcohol, which is there is no kind of I mean, there is not a huge campaign trying to match those things. No, that if you have a risky behavior consuming alcohol, and especially among youth that have really risky behaviors. I mean, there is an important group, an increasing group that consume a lot alcohol, and that's kind of a warning for the Junta Nacional de Drogas too.
Yeah, I think that Astrid's question about the legacies of the historical past is really interesting, particularly considering that some of the results is that older people and people who may have lived that dictatorships in the past are the ones who are opposed to marijuana. So I would say that that would be something really interesting to explore eventually. And I completely agree. Tabaré is not Pepe Mujica, but we have to wait for him to actually assume power and for some of these regulations to actually take place. So as one of our discussants says, it's going to be like the real impact of this is going to be measured maybe not in the next year or so. It's going to be measured long term so that we can actually see the real impact of that. And then really quick about the regional context, most of their concerns have to be with marijuana trafficking into their borders, particularly Argentina and Brazil. Now, the question of whether this is going to create a domino effect or anything in the long run, most of the discussion in Latin America particularly has been about decriminalization. They haven't really been talking much about let's create this big state system where the state is going to take such a big role in controlling marijuana. So everybody who has talked about that from Perez Molina in Guatemala, from Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, it's mostly towards decriminalization. And there is some decriminalization of certain drugs, including marijuana and including other drugs in places like Argentina. But all of that has happened through judicial measures, through the courts actually saying, okay, let's decriminalize a certain small amounts of personal marijuana possession. But that opens the same kind of worms that Uruguay had in the past where, sure, possession can be legal, you can have it, but how do you access it? So we're going to have to wait and see how this is going to develop in the long run.
Just going to add a couple of things about policy recommendations about whether how open the Uruguayan government is, and I think it's pretty open so far. I mean, our experience has been that this research has taken place with an important dialogue with people at the Junta, with people at the Observatorio, I myself find that particularly interesting, seeing the way other governments tend to react to research. And I find in the case of Uruguay a very different attitude, and I expect that will be the attitude in the incoming government too, because it seems to be sort of long tradition of doing research on the things in Uruguay. So I think we are in a very good place to use this and to present this to the government, and the government using the data basically to modify policies. And as Hannah said, there's a lot of flexibility. The government has shown a lot of flexibility on this, so we see that. And the second point is about the issue of the thing about the role of the market in Uruguay. Well, in the case of Uruguay, it's very different from the U.S., as has been told. Actually, in the U.S., the regulation of marijuana is kind of very market-driven, especially in Colorado. In Uruguay, it's very state-driven. And you have the state very much present in everything. Now, having said this, when I was there, one of the times I was there, when we have Uruguay had the marijuana fair, and the marijuana fair was really interesting. We attended and we basically spent the whole afternoon over there. It was really interesting because what we saw there is sort of the potential of the market to take over, right? There were any number of firms or companies, local, international firms. They're promoting their paraphernalia of marijuana, everything related to marijuana, and basically ready to take over. Then the next day we attended a meeting with people in the government and civil society, and it was to some extent was shocking to me that within the discussion there was no discussion about the role of the market at all, right? that's part of the the Uruguayan political culture in which the state is very present and the market tends to be very weak, right? But even after looking what was happening in the fair and then looking at the discussions, that the government still seems to me that doesn't realize that there is a potential over there for, as you said, the market capitalism basically to take over in different ways, and the government not really thinking about that. So, you want to say something, Anna, or yeah?
Yeah. Well, we'll grab some of the rest. Just a quick thing. If anyone watches John Oliver and is interested in Uruguay's tobacco policy, he did a really good segment on it last week. On the passive asset and substitution question, it's actually beyond studying empirically whether there's the substitution effect and it goes down. This opens up new opportunities for the government to do clinical trials, and there's actually one in the works in Uruguay right now to take passive asset users and put them on marijuana as a form of treatment and see what happens. So those results will be very interesting. On Jamaica, just a point about ancestral, religious, cultural uses. There are a couple of precedences, and the bill in Jamaica is a decrim bill, but it also has medical use, religious use, therapeutic use, and scientific use. So I was pleased to see that there was this effort given to including the Rastafarian community in their bill explicitly and allowing Rastafarian community to special permission to use it. So, and this actually comes on the heels of Bolivia did something similar at the UN with its ancestral coca chewing, and Native Americans in the U.S. have a special permission regarding peyote. So I think it is important for governments to keep doing that and considering ancestral uses. I'm glad Jamaica is, and I think that actually passed the Senate, and apparently Bo said it passed the House yesterday. So, good job, Jamaica. I agree. This is a whole other conversation, but the categorizations of what drugs are legal and illegal, they're not based on science or relative harms, and commission after government-appointed commission after commission in pretty much, well, most countries and also the U.S. have said again and again marijuana should be decriminalized, and then they're thrown out by the government because it's not what they want to hear. But a whole other topic is the fact that in a large part in the U.S., the motivations for making some drugs illegal has to do with racism and perceptions of who is using drugs, racism and xenophobia, and who is using those drugs. So it's really not scientifically based, unfortunately. For the future of marijuana in Uruguay under Tabaré, he's not Mujica, but he has committed to executing it. And some people do kind of say that Mujica is the dreamer, the ideological president, and Vasquez is an implementer and executor and might be able actually to do this better. And in any case, even if he's not personally committed, the person who's just come in as the new drug czar, Milton Romani, he was the former drug czar, and he was one of the first people in Uruguay to say marijuana should be legalized. So his reappointment signals kind of a continuity for this law, and he will definitely support it and back it. And then lastly, on kind of, do we have any insider knowledge on what governments around Latin America, how they've reacted to Uruguay? None have come out and really, either publicly or privately, shamed Uruguay. So they might talk, the president of Mexico said, I don't believe in legalization for Mexico, and then there are various echoes of those sentiments, but not one has come out and said what Uruguay is doing is negative. And there's actually been some positive approvals in what they're doing. It's interesting. And behind the scenes, actually, Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, and I think Mexico all have sent special delegations from their national drug councils to Uruguay to study the law, and have, I think with Ecuador and Brazil, actually officially signed kind of agreements to continue this studying and this investigation. So what Uruguay is doing is against the grain, but no country has really come out. And even the U.S. actually ambassador in Uruguay, and this is the U.S., which was, the creator of prohibition, and is a reason why a lot of countries in Latin America and the Caribbean don't want to move forward because of fear of U.S. Repercussions. The U.S. ambassador, when Uruguay passed it, came out in the press and said, this is an internal issue for Uruguay. We wish them well. It's not our position.
Well.
I was going to hit on your point about the economics of this, and Jose Miguel, kind of following up on what you were saying, and it's interesting. So, as someone who studies the economics of these markets, and the conversations I've had in the United States versus the, I guess, 3 times I was down in Montevideo. I mean, the taxes and revenues, that's just not really it wasn't part of the discussion beforehand, even afterhand. There are other issues that they cared about. But in the United States, this idea that you're going to bring in a lot of money, it gets a lot of attention, and it polls well. And so this is why, I mean, you'll see this, it's featured prominently when folks are advocating for this and trying to get it on the ballot. But we have to keep in mind is, yes, money does come in, and we are seeing money come in Washington and Colorado, but it's often not as much as we originally thought. And I mean, we have to put this in perspective. The voters in Washington State were told that if they legalize over the first 5 years, they could bring in up to $1.5 to $2 billion in revenue to the state. So far, they've brought in, I think it's in the double-digit millions. Now, not to say that that's not useful, that's not money that can go toward other causes, but you have to kind of put this all in perspective. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is kind of help people understand, here's the ball, it's hard to project, but here are your ballpark figures. But what you have to keep in mind is that when you're thinking about this, revenue is only one part of the equation. There are other potential benefits associated with legalizing. Advocates will make arguments about, just the criminal justice costs and also the costs associated with having a conviction on your criminal record. I mean, so there are other potential benefits, but there are also social costs associated with this. I mean, marijuana is not a benign substance. I mean, people do run into problems, and a lot of the research that's been done on marijuana was done on people that were using marijuana that was 3, 4, 5% THC. Things have changed a bit. I mean, marijuana, the THC levels have gone up. It's often exaggerated about how much it has gone up, but they have gone up, and there are other products, and we just don't know about the health consequences. And so I think we are going to kind of learn more over time there. But when you're thinking about the economics of this, especially in developed countries, you have to realize that the production costs after legalization are just going to plummet. Realize, because a lot of what's driving the kind of the large costs is the risk. When someone buys marijuana or cocaine or heroin, a lot of what they're doing is compensating the drug dealers and everyone else along the supply chain for the risk of arrest, risk of incarceration. You legalize marijuana, that goes away. You also expect there to be increasing economies of scale. And just to kind of put this in perspective, we did some work when we were trying to project what would happen if California legalized. And I mean, depending on, so if you were to go up to Northern California, up to Humboldt County, and you wanted to get a pound of high-potency marijuana from one of the growers there, depending on the time of the year right now, it's still wholesale, running about $1,500. But if you were able to farm marijuana like any other agricultural product that you transplant, so be thinking cherry tomatoes or asparagus, I mean, you could produce enough marijuana to get you kind of the level of intoxication that you would get from that pound that you would get up in Humboldt County for less than $40 a pound. So so you can expect that over time, especially if you allow private companies to get involved, that it's just going to push those production distribution costs down. Now, I know many of you are thinking, well, we could just put a big tax on it, and that would allow us to kind of control the price. Well, first of all, you have to realize that if there's a really large tax that you slap on it, there still could be a black market there. And some people, one of the goals for doing this is to get rid of the black market. But the other thing to keep in mind, and like I said, this is especially an issue here in the United States, is that we don't know the best way to tax marijuana. Do you tax it as a function of the price, of the weight, of the potency? Now, all of those, there are trade-offs with all of those options. And so one of the things, as I talk to jurisdictions that are thinking about this, I think it's important that you kind of build flexibility. If you're going to go down this path, you build in flexibility, because as I said, no one knows the best way to do this. And it may be that in 5 to 10 years, you may realize, oh, wait, we were taxing it as a function of price, but it turns out we should have been taxing it differently. And so the question is if you're designing one of these regimes, how easy will it be to make those changes? Are you going to have to go back to the legislature? Or will that change be built in? So that flexibility. And that's just something you don't hear a lot in the United States. And that's very different, getting back to Uruguay. In Uruguay, I mean, with President Mojica and with the head of the junta, I mean, you would hear individuals talk about how this is an experiment. And then based on the research, if it doesn't work out well, they may try something else. You hear that a lot more in Uruguay than you do in the United States.
Thank you. Sorry for keeping you standing, Liso, and then
Thank you, everyone, for being here at FIU. It's really great to have the opportunity to speak to you about the groundbreaking work you're doing. I have 2 quick questions. The one thing I keep going back to when we're thinking about Uruguay being a model is the fact that Uruguay is not like Colombia Ecuador, Argentina, and Brazil. So although I appreciate that those governments are paying attention, I don't think it's necessarily realistic for us to think that a country like Uruguay, when you look at its population, you look at its political culture, you look at, years of stability, economic growth, it's really not typical of the region. So I want to hear your comments about whether or not Uruguay could really serve as a model, and if it could work in these other places. I would say it probably couldn't in the way it's built now. And the other thing I'm interested in is if there have been any advocacy groups formed now in Uruguay and what they're doing, particularly among young people using social media, to try to create some kind of shift in public opinion. Thank you.
How you doing? My name's Juan. I'm a graduate student in LACC. My question is in regards to the private business sector. You guys have, your data has shown that people are more willing to purchase from pharmacies. But your data also has said that individuals are unwilling or have not, in the majority, have not agreed to this bill being passed. Now, my question is, are pharmacies willing to, what is their discussions? Have they been okay with selling this? Will the government fine them if they're not selling? What implementations are going to take place in there?
Hello, my name is Ricardo Victoria. I am an alumni of FIU. Basically, one of my questions is to Dr. Kilmer. I have read about the varieties of the scums with high contents of THC. I was last week in Costa Rica, and it happened that I got a newspaper and I read about an article and this Dr. Murray from the King's College mentioned that high contents of THC cause psychosis in people, contrary to hashish that has high contents of cannabinoids. My question is specific for Dr. Kilmer. What is that intersection that you're talking about between public health and public safety? How we can control or narrow that intersection?
Thank you for being here. My name is Leonardo Mancheno, a student of Politics and International Relations student. And my question is, as Uruguayans, what do you think would be the reason why the youth, the young people there consume marijuana? Is the technology have influence in that, like a trend? I have another question. How does the law enforcement, the laws itself, deals or battle with this issue? Let's say I go to Uruguay and I rent a house and I start growing marijuana. What would be the punishment for me as a marijuana grower? What would be the punishment for my dealers? And what would be the punishment for the person that is buying, for the consumer? And I have another question, which is really quick, on what would be, how does the church, being a very important, playing an important role in our countries. I am from Ecuador, from Latin America. So basically, as far as I know, the church play a really big role in Latin America specifically. How does the church have reacted in regard to this issue? And the first question that I asked was because being a drug user in Latin America is a big deal. You get like stigmatized. And, I remember when I tried marijuana, I was 17 years old. I don't do drugs. I mean, I don't have any type of addiction, thanks God. But that's very dangerous. And I remember when I tried marijuana, I was 17 years old, a little old. And for that, and maybe I was hanging out with the wrong people. But that was a really big deal. We were trying to find a place, a hidden place to do it, because we knew that was something really bad. I mean, we were doing it even though we knew that was, a bad thing to do. Okay, that's pretty much my question.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amelia Solomon. I'm a grad student with the LACC program. And my question is, we've seen what's going to be the impact with marijuana legalization in Uruguay. But I also want to know a little bit more about the international impact that's going to have with the legalization, and also particularly the impact that's going to have on the UN Office of Drug and Crime. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give opportunity or discussions first this time. Well,
Sure, yes. So with respect to the public health implications of how of cannabis legalization, and it's, as I said, it's really hard to project. First of all, since no country has done this, but it's also especially hard to project because we don't know how it's going to end up influencing the use of alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs. And so that's why, for those of you who haven't made your mind up on this and are going to kind of look at the research, it's going to take a while before we actually know how this plays out. So you're not going to get that information next year. And even when we do get information about what happens in the short run, things could be very different in the long run. But this is where research is going to be really important, and where, as I mentioned before, I think we're going to have to change some of the data instruments that we have in order to be able to get better information here. But your point about marijuana and psychosis, or marijuana in general, and public, or marijuana and mental health, is, this is a really controversial issue. And you have to think about this in terms of the marijuana plant. There are dozens of cannabinoids. Most of the research is focused on THC. That's what gets you high, but that's what also increases the probability of panic attacks or anxiety. Another cannabinoid that's been getting much more attention in recent years is CBD. CBD is believed to offset some of the anxiety or some of the antipsychotic effects of THC, and there's beliefs that it actually has therapeutic value. They're actually doing clinical trials right now with a solution that's mostly all CBD, especially for helping kids with experiencing seizures or Dravet syndrome. But so the general idea has been, there has been this increase in THC and the THC levels over time. And so I did some work analyzing seizures, marijuana seizures in California. And one of the things, kind of looking at the THC and the CBD values, and one of the things we found is that kind of over time, as the amount of the THC content of what was seized was increasing, you also kind of saw this decrease in CBD. And at the time, people weren't really paying attention to CBD. And I think what they realized is that what they were doing to breed to kind of increase the THC was actually decreasing the CBD. So there was always kind of anecdotal evidence that people thought that it was because it wasn't necessarily just because it was high THC marijuana that could potentially be influencing mental health issues, but it was also the fact that there wasn't much CBD there. Whereas with hashish, there tends to be more of a balance between THC and CBD. Whereas with the marijuana flower that was being consumed by a lot of people, it was a lot of high THC and low CBD. And so, definitely, the research is very clear that THC can increase the probability of experiencing psychotic symptoms. They've done clinical trials where they've injected people with THC. We know that. But whether or not how the different combinations, how that's actually going to influence the experience of, or the probability of experiencing these symptoms, which is very, and remember, experiencing psychotic symptoms is very different than having a full-blown disorder. Those are things you want to kind of keep in mind when you're kind of reading this literature. But getting back into this, so what's a jurisdiction to do? Well, jurisdictions that are thinking about doing something besides prohibiting marijuana, they have a lot of options, not only with respect to taxation and who produces, but also the regulations. So in theory, one of the things jurisdictions could do is they could begin thinking about maybe regulating the amount of THC or the amount of CBD that's in these products. The Dutch, for the last 2 years, have had a pretty serious discussion about potentially limiting the THC of the products that are sold in the coffee shops at 15%. Now, I have no idea how they came up with that 15%. There isn't a lot of science there. But this is something that jurisdictions that are thinking about this, they could potentially regulate that. And it gets back to that other point when I was mentioning about flexibility. Like I said, we don't know the right way to tax marijuana. No one really knows the right way to regulate it either. And I think jurisdictions are going to be learning over time. And so if you're designing one of these regimes, you kind of want to have that flexibility to begin to regulate those products if you saw kind of an uptake in problems that you wanted to ameliorate.
So I'd just like to tackle 3 of those points. And I'll start with the role of the church because I found with some anecdotes that I really love. And that was surprising to me as, a non-Uruguayan coming in and living in Uruguay and realizing that the role of the church is very small, almost non-existent in public policy. So Uruguay is, I think, very unique in Latin America in just how little the church actually plays a role in politics. And the anecdotes that I love is that in Uruguay officially, so the church and the state have been separated since 1917, and officially they don't call Easter Semana Santa, they call it Semana de Turismo, and they call Christmas Dia de la Familia instead of Navidad, and this is like officially speaking. So that's just two anecdotes that I really like on how little the church has a role in politics. And so with the marijuana campaign, nothing came out from any of the religious groups. They didn't make any comments about it, and even if they had it, it wouldn't have played a role. And when I was down in Uruguay, the Pope actually had made some statements on criminalization, and everywhere else in Latin America, this was really picked up, and a lot of the other drug policy reform groups that work in Latin America were freaking out about the impact that would have in their countries. Uruguay, it had zero impact whatsoever. For the UN and the international arena, that's a very interesting question, because this does put Uruguay in violation of the treaties, under the strictest interpretation of the treaties, in ways that Holland, Portugal, and medical marijuana don't. There is allowance for those, but on the production side, that is a violation. They didn't do what Bolivia did, which was step out and then re-enter with a reservation for the coca leaf with a vote. Uruguay's tactic and strategy has been ignoring it to a large extent. Right after it was voted, the International Narcotics Control Board sent a very angry letter to Uruguay saying this is a violation of the treaties and we want to come visit you, and they basically ignored it. And then the head of the INCB called Uruguay a nation of pirates, and that got Mujica really angry, and he said on public radio, this guy should come talk to me about it. And so initially their strategy, was just not to pay heed to it, and now they are getting their team of lawyers, and they're starting to form their arguments about this. And the foreign minister has gone to the UN and already spoken about this, and this is what's echoing more and more, is that the UN drug control treaties, first of all, they were created under a very different world and decades ago, and that the world has changed since then, and that at the heart of the UN drug control conventions is the aim to protect the public health and welfare of mankind. And so what Uruguay is arguing is that this law actually goes into their jurisdiction under their constitution, and there is some leeway in the UN treaties about what you're allowed to do within your own sovereign country, and that this law is aimed at protecting public health and public security of Uruguayan citizens. So they're going to come at it more in terms of this is within the spirit of the conventions rather than within the fine text. There are in the worst case, there are very few things that the UN can actually, it's not a binding treaty that can be enforced. In the worst case, I think 2/3 of countries would have to vote for Uruguay to be penalized, and the penalization would be certain things within trade of other legal drugs, but I don't think 2/3 of countries would ever do that. So it has generated a very interesting debate in the UN space, and actually in 2016 there's going to be a big UN General Assembly special session to study the issue of drugs and evaluate our policies, and that was called on by the presidents of Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala, with the intention of critically evaluating the UN drug control system. Now, things happen very slowly at the UN, so don't expect anything to be radically altered, but there is this opening a creak of the door at the UN, and Uruguay has played a big part in it. And finally, on the advocacy groups, and I just like to comment because I loved working with the advocacy groups in Uruguay. It was a really special coalition that I don't think new ones have really formed since. What has formed is these cannabis social clubs, but in terms of advocacy organizations, those already exist. And the characteristics of those were interesting. In the US, it's much more drug policy, specifically reform organizations. In Uruguay, the social movement is very collaborative. So the organizations that formed part of the campaign were, human rights organizations, LGBT organizations, environmental organizations, students group, trades unions, very, very diverse, that all came together to support this issue and still continue to support it. And then there are some of the more marijuana cannabis organizations that do advocate for it as well. And it's just the fabric of that is really beautiful and something we don't have in the US, where it's much more fragmented, but like the way they collaborate and also the transparency and the way they work with the government is very exceptional.
Is the Uruguayan model one to export? We don't know. I mean, you were rightly mentioning all the characteristics that tend to make Uruguay unique within the region and in the world. But, I mean, probably no policy model is to export as a whole. But the experience itself is someone that is worth looking at. I mean, perhaps, my sense, and this is very tentative because as I think we all agree we need to wait and wait long to see the results of the policy, that if the Uruguayan model fails, well, that'd be hard to buy to be used in other countries. If the model succeeds, well, we don't know which parts of it will be able to experience successfully in other countries. But we have a full new model there in place with different, subsets and different ways to access marijuana. So, we should just need to keep an eye on it and see how it works. Pharmacies are part of this model, and it's unclear the role they will play. I mean, when this law was being debated in Congress, the pharmacy unions, so to speak, presented themselves before Congress saying, hey, you know what, we are the ones to do this. I mean, we have the monopoly of all drugs, of legal drugs, and we know how to store them, how to control, so we are really well suited to this. However, after, that event, many pharmacies are showing their concern, safety concerns, what will happen, in their surroundings, how will they need to keep the storage of the, of marijuana? So we really don't know. But I mean, as the law is settled, yeah, marijuana will be sold in pharmacies. We don't know what will happen, with pharmacies who will reject to do that. Will they be obliged to do it? We really don't know. The government has decided on the specifics of this yet. I mean, the marijuana that will be sold in pharmacies has not even been planted yet, so we still have some time to deal with that. And law enforcement, it's another important issue to consider. And the law enforcement part of the new regulation somehow has also been, I wouldn't say neglected, but pushed, backwards by the government. And there has not been, a protocol developed for, police officers deal with this new paradigm, or even for, judges and justices. So we have, maybe you have as well heard in the press, cases in which, a perfectly legal cultivator, someone who had the right number of plants, who had been registered before the state. Okay, this guy got his plants seized. And this is because, some neighbor, reported to the to the local police stations, and the police officer just went there, with the proper order, found the plants. They you are allowed by law to have up to 6 plants that have, female plants, the active THC plants. And this guy had 11 plants, but only 6 of them were, had the substance. So law enforcement officers don't have all the tools to determine when, a culture is legal, when it's not legal. They have not been trained to do that, and they are a bit uncomfortable about this situation per what we have, heard directly from them. So this is another challenge, to instruct law enforcement, into the law.
An answer regarding the young people and how easy it is to get marijuana. It has changed a lot. For example, I will say that 10 years ago or even 12 years ago, it was easy to see. It was very frequently to see people smoking marijuana, for example, in soccer games, or in a rock show, or at the beach. But now you can find people smoking marijuana everywhere. I mean, you walk to the supermarket, and the guy who is walking beside you is, instead of smoking a cigarette, he's smoking marijuana. So, and nobody gets surprised, and nobody says, "Oh, he's smoking marijuana." It has been. I think that we have get used to see young people smoking marijuana in the street. So there is not there is no a condemned behavior anymore in that sense that you were saying. And even more, I think it's kind of trendy and fashion to smoke marijuana, and it's kind of, okay, I'm young, I smoke marijuana. This is something that is there too. So on the youth thing, I think this has to be we need more research on that, on how young people really feel in this kind of new consumption behavior, that there are very few studies regarding young behaviors related with marijuana. So the other thing is that I want to answer is that if the question about if Uruguay would be like a model for other countries. And usually Uruguay is classified as a weird country or an exceptional country for many things. Like, oh, we are high on political culture, the stability of our democracy, many things. So in one way you can say, okay, if this works here in Uruguay with this kind of characteristics, that low level of corruptions, respect for the rule of law, and many other things that kind of are kind of nice characteristics for the implementation of this law. You can say, okay, if this law works in Uruguay, this doesn't mean that it can work in other countries where these other characteristics are not present. But if it doesn't work, and I think this is the challenge for this experiment, because if it doesn't work here in Uruguay with such a nice settlement of these characteristics, where else should it work? That's kind of I think that's a kind of a pressure for the implementation of the policy.
I think also that the reason for the youth to be able to use marijuana is not only are they seeing other people using it, but now that Uruguay has this model where marijuana is going to be allowed to be grown in houses, right? How do you control when you're a parent who smokes marijuana that your child's not going to smoke marijuana? So it's that socialization process that it has become really acceptable. And let's remember, like since 1974, this has been decriminalized. Even though, if you traffic or you have big possession, it will still be illegal. So I think that that's another interesting point to look in the long term, like how does the presence of the marijuana plants in the actual household impact the acceptance of marijuana usage among the youth? And also, with regards to law enforcement, how do you enforce that people under 18 do not access the plants that they have in their home? Like, ideally, in the law, it says 480 grams, only for people over 18 who are Uruguayan citizens. But how do we really enforce that, right? Let's say that anybody in this room is a tourist and goes to Uruguay and stays at the house of a Uruguayan friend who has marijuana. And one night they just start drinking or doing something, and they're like, okay, the plant is right there, let me grab some and try to smoke it. How does the police regulate that? How does the system regulate that? So even though internationally there's this kind of roadblocks for foreigners to not be able to register, they would still kind of be able to access it if they're persistent enough. Also, with regards to the question that Leonardo had with the issue of, okay, if I go and I start growing marijuana and the police finds me, let's remember it's still illegal to traffic. It's still illegal under the law. The only thing that's legal is when you are registered. So if you're not registered, sure, the police can find you, but it would still be considered a punishable offense. I remember when I was doing my research on this, reading this report from the Washington Office on Latin America, that the impact on the criminal justice system of this legalization is about this study that Gariboto did in that report. She basically said that out of the people who are imprisoned in Uruguay right now, about 70% of those in prison for marijuana offenses, 70%, meaning 7 out of 10, would fall within the 40 grams per month that they will be allowed to have. So the impact on the criminal justice system is something that we could have, that we could see in the long term. And it's these measures that we should look forward to with this implementation. Now, to touch really quickly upon the international stuff, even within the International Drug Control Board, there was this big debate. So yeah, Raymond Jans came out and said, Uruguayans are pirates, and they sent this really angry memo to Uruguay. But even within the board, people like Francisco Thumi and other people were having this debate within it, basically saying, look, it's their sovereignty. Let's see and wait how it happens. So even if there was like an international response, there's still fragmentation in those responses. The United States, like Hannah said before, like if you have this country that was the prohibitionist model, that was like the country that put it forth, but the United States has legal marijuana in several states. So how can the United States go out and tell Uruguay, like, oh no, it's wrong for you to do this when it's doing the same thing in its own backyard? So it's those things to keep in mind. And Uruguay is actually even beyond the idea of welfare. Some Uruguayans have argued with the UN that this is an issue of human rights, and it falls within our jurisdiction to provide for human rights welfare. So they're trying to do this paradigm shift that opens a very interesting international debate and opens a very interesting domestic debate. And I think that it's something we have to look forward to see how this develops, not only right now and not only within the borders of Uruguay, but the international impacts within the region and internationally.
Let me just add a couple of things, especially with this question whether Uruguay can be a model, right, for the rest of Latin America, especially under the light that Uruguay is so different. I think Uruguay can be a model, but it is a model not too much in terms of this is what you have to do. This is the recipe that you have to follow, but in terms of how do you tackle a problem that has been basically deemed untouchable in the region or in the world, right? And then have this sort of courage to try something different, right? Considering your own circumstances, your own context, right? So I think the model of Uruguay is basically opening this to discussion in public policy and going forward with this, even with some sort of modesty and honesty, saying, look, I mean, we're trying. We don't know whether this is gonna work or not, but we're flexible and we can change it. What we know is that the prohibition model hasn't worked and is not working for many countries. So why don't we try this? I mean, and I would say, to the extent that we can see the Uruguayan as a model in terms of how to tackle these important social problems, right? So all those issues, that could be useful, but not in terms of you have to legalize and you have to regulate, and that will be the, as Hannah said, the blue pill, right? That will fix everything. No, it's not. It's not gonna do that. But the good thing about this, and actually you can see it now, that in every forum international, there are discussions about this, and those discussions open opportunities. But here, and I want to end up with this, and here comes our role as academics. I mean, when these things happen, we have to be ready to be there, to start measuring, to evaluating, to be assessing what is happening, right? And to be able to provide hard data and information whether this is useful or not. And the truth is about this is, we just realized that we're doing it with my colleagues, is that we know very little about this, right? And I think one of the most important things we learn is that we still have a long way to go in order to understand what will be the implications of this, not only in Uruguay, but in the region, and even if other countries decide to move ahead with this. But the important thing is to be there and be ready to basically tackle this in an academic way. And with this, I would like to thank again my guests, my colleagues, for coming, and to you. And two things before I finish. First, the summary is available over there in that table. If you haven't got it, you should get it. And second, there is plenty of food. So please don't go outside with the stomach empty. Please share with us. Thank you very much all.